It's going to divide the country even more than it is now. It's going to be a very, very bad time, I'm afraid. And again, I don't mean to sound hyperbolic, and I'm certainly not the only one who holds this view.
These final days are going to be nail-biting, not just for the candidates or for the American people. It really is on a knife edge, and calling this race seems nearly impossible.
Well, Allan Lichtman is known, I don't know whether it's a compliment or not, as the Nostradamus of American political polling. He certainly has a good record. He has correctly called 9 out of the last 10 presidential elections. That's going all the way back to 1984. And the one the question marks over certainly had a late surprise. Now, he uses a system of which he published under the name Keys to the White House. So let's speak to the distinguished professor of history at the American University, Allan Lichtman. I think I'm right in saying that last month you did make a call and you said that you thought Kamala Harris was going to win. Is that still your position?
Yeah, that is still my position. I issued my prediction deliberately on September 5th before the Harris-Trump debate that all the pundits saying was going to be so pivotal in deciding the election, because the big message of my system, the Keys to the White House, is that it's governing, not campaigning, that counts. And the keys gauge the strength and performance of the White House party. And I have not changed my prediction of a Kamala Harris win, despite all the vicissitudes of the campaign, which have gone in both directions. Let's not forget, Harris whipped him badly in the debate, and that didn't seem to move anyone or anything. But my prediction still stands, and I have a 40-year track record behind it.
And if you could summarize, why you think it's the case that she's likely to be elected, what is it?
Yes, I have 13 keys that have been right since I predicted Ronald Reagan's re-election in April 1982, nearly 3 years ahead of time, when 60% of Americans said he was too old to run again. It's a purely nonpartisan system. I've predicted the two most conservative presidents of our time, Reagan and Trump, along with liberals like Obama. And the way it works, of my 13 keys, if 6 or more go against the White House party, they're predicted losers. Otherwise, they're predicted winners. And here are the keys that I counted against Harris and the incumbent Democrats. My mandate key, because Democrats lost U.S. House seats in 2022. Incumbency, obviously Biden is not running. The vice president does not count. Foreign military failure. The Middle East is a disaster, a humanitarian catastrophe with no good end in sight. That's 3. And incumbent charisma. These charisma keys, I have 2 of them, are very high threshold keys. We're talking about a once in a generation, inspirational across the board candidate like Franklin Roosevelt, the Democrat, or Ronald Reagan, the Republican, whatever you may think of Harris. She's only been a candidate for a little while. She hasn't risen to a status of an FDR. So that's 4 keys down, 2 keys short of predicting Trump returning to the White House and Harris losing. That's why I predict a new path-breaking president, our first woman president, and America's first president of mixed African and Asian descent, which kind of foreshadows where the U.S. is going. We're rapidly becoming a majority-minority country. Old white guys like me are on the decline.
And that might be said to be really the main motivation for MAGA, that old white guys want to fight back.
That's absolutely right.
Now, this prediction this time round you've had quite a lot of heat in your direction, and you've got into a bit of a spat with some of the forecasters who, working from polls, are saying actually things look like they're on Trump's side.
Yes, that was the same thing in 2016, where I defied the pollsters and all of the conventional wisdom to predict a Donald Trump win in the election, which did not make me popular in 90% plus Democratic Washington, D.C., where I teach at American University. But I did get a note after the election on the Washington Post article where I predicted Trump's win, and it said, "Congrats, Professor, good call," and in big Sharpie letters, Donald J. Trump. The keys are the alternative to the polls, which are snapshots. They are not predictors. They are abused as predictors. Remember in 2016, depending on the time of day you checked in with him, Nate Silver, the famous compiler of polls, said a 70 to 80% chance Hillary Clinton would win. Then when she loses, he says, see, I told you, a 20% plus chance she could lose, which means if he can't be wrong, he can never be right either. I go right out on a limb and tell you who I think is going to win or lose. So I can be proven right or wrong for sure.
Have you had any abuse from Donald Trump for coming out against him this time?
No, but I'll have to tell you, I have never experienced, and I've been doing this, as I told you, since 1982. I have never experienced the kind of hate that I have been heaped on this time. I have received the most scurrilous, the most vulgar, the most violent, the most threatening kind of hate, absolutely unprecedented in over 40 years. The security of my family has been compromised. I've had to put the police on notice, secure, in a very strong way, our home. And I have to say, I attribute this to the toxic politics of violence and disorder promoted by Donald Trump. Before Donald Trump, sure, I got criticized. I've been criticized for 42 years, but never this kind of hate, violent and threatening criticism, and my family being put in jeopardy.
How worried are you about being wrong?
I'm always worried. I'm 77, and every 4 years I get butterflies in my stomach. My keys retrospectively go all the way back to 1860, when we had no planes, no automobiles, no radio, no television. Women couldn't vote. African Americans are enslaved. So they cover 160 years of enormous changes in our society, our politics, our demography, and our economy. But look, I'm not psychic Gene Dixon with a crystal ball. I'm not Speaker Mike Johnson who thinks the Almighty speaks to him. My system's based on 160 years of historical patterns. So I have a lot of confidence in it. But of course, there could be something so catastrophic to change that pattern. But the problem is, you never know it in advance. You could only recognize it afterwards. That's why in 2008, I didn't listen to the critics who said, oh, America can never elect an African-American president. I stuck with my Obama prediction. Or in 2016, when people said, oh, the Access Hollywood tape with Trump bragging about sexually assaulting women, that knocks him out. You got to change your prediction. I don't change my predictions on the fly. If I did, I'd be wrong a lot.
Allan Lichtman, thank you very much indeed. A man worth listening to.
There's a lot going on. Like, I don't know if you guys know this, but there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico.
Times' New York correspondent Will Pavia has just left the Trump rally we've been talking about over the last hour and can join us now with an update. Hi there, Will.
Hey.
Hi, welcome. What was the atmosphere like there at Madison Square Garden? You've got a lot of people who are very excited, but also, as ever with these things, I'm seeing pictures online of people leaving early.
Yes, I mean, that did happen. I think people had queued up. I mean, some of them have been here since yesterday. They set aside two east-west sort of cross streets between 6th Avenue and 7th Avenue for people to queue up in. So those were completely filled with people. It was quite an extraordinary sight to see, just down from the Empire State Building, essentially a canyon full of Trump hats. And so the place filled up and people were inside by about 2 o'clock. So they spent a lot of time standing, and then there was hours and hours of sort of support act kind of speakers, I suppose, before Trump arrived. And he didn't really get on until about 8 o'clock in the evening. And initially there was a lot of energy for him and a lot of laughter at some of his kind of stranger asides, and a lot of there was a lot of cheers for some of the things he pledged to do. But people were leaving. After about half an hour or so, the area that I was in was sort of emptying out. So yes, I think the energy gradually dissipated, and perhaps it was asking a lot of people to spend quite that much time in an arena.
And in terms of New York as a city, how do they vote? I mean, how popular is Donald Trump there? Is this a minority of people who would be swamping out Madison Square Garden?
Yes, it's a strange thing to see this many Trump supporters in Manhattan, in the middle of Manhattan. I mean, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was something like 14% Republican in Manhattan the last election. Now, some of the Staten Island votes Republican and has a Republican congresswoman. And then, there are some sort of parts of Queens that are a little bit redder, but it is for the most part a very liberal city. And when you see someone in a red hat, normally you sort of stop because you're not very used to it. So it was a strange thing. A lot of the people that I sort of met queuing up were, from Queens, or they were from Connecticut or New Jersey, and they talked about the long journeys they'd had to get in. So it did feel in some respects like, people coming into a sort of a place that was almost like foreign to the Republican Party in a way, and not somewhere that they would normally focus on, because it's not really a swing state, even though Trump promised everybody that it was.
And also not an audience that all looked entirely the same either. I mean, something I can see just from, who's going in and out of there demographically on the feed that I'm looking at is, there are some Latinos, there's some African Americans, there are visibly observant Jews, etc. And yet some of the response that I'm seeing online to what happened there regarded some racist remarks that were made by speakers before Trump came to the stage, some of his warm-up acts, who were sort of making basically racist jokes. I know America's a different country, and, they do a lot of culturally sensitive material there, which often to the English ear just frankly sounds racist, but it does seem to have gone down badly, including with some Republicans in Florida where the Latino vote is very important.
I mean, it's very surprising to have that at a track, especially when you're, 9 days away from an election. I mean, I suppose what they will say is that this guy was not, he was the comedian that they'd booked.
It's Tony Hinchcliffe made the remark.
Yeah, it was very strange. And sorry, there's a lot of sirens going up 6th Avenue. And there were one or two other remarks. Someone described Kamala Harris as being Malaysian via California or something, and made some slightly sort of, it's just stuff that you would think that, in 2024 people would steer clear of. And certainly not the sort of thing you'd normally hear at a venue in New York City. So yes, that was slightly puzzling. I have to say Trump sort of, his rhetoric is also, can be pretty fiery. I mean, at some point he got the largest cheer, or one of the largest cheers, when he said that he would automatically have the death penalty for any migrant that killed an American citizen. So there was there was sort of a, there was quite a lot about ending the migrant invasion and this kind of thing, which was a sort of seen as a sort of red meat line for his supporters, I suppose.
Yeah.
But you're right. It's very surprising that kind of rhetoric was there as well.
I mean, it just seems a strange, we're talking about it like it's a decision. It may well have just been an off-the-cuff remark by a comedian who they booked, to be fair. But it seems like a strange thing because it's going to now be part of the news agenda, isn't it? Are Latino Republicans turning away from Trump at the very moment? He really would not want that, surely, to be the story.
No, of course not. No, I mean, the whole point of this was that this was the triumphant return to the city where he was indicted and, in fact, convicted. And that was certainly, most of the speakers were trying to sort of make that point, that who would have thought that Donald Trump would come back here, of all places. And people like Tucker Carlson, who is sort of known for fairly kind of for rhetoric that's not cautious, sort of talked about Trump like being like the sort of person who gets thrown out of a bar, and all his friends are still inside, and he comes back anyway. So I don't know. I certainly think that's certainly not what Trump or his advisors would have looked for. And I'm sure if it does overshadow what's reported, they'll be very cross about it. He did also spend a lot of time attacking the media, and sort of calling them the fake news media, and everyone sort of turned and gave their middle finger to the press.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean,
so
that's all par for the course with him, isn't it? But what was the thing? I mean, as it just so happens, I've got Matteo Bergamini with me, who's a journalist and a campaigner at Shout Out UK, who talk about disinformation. So I'm just curious, can you remember an example of something that he was claiming was fake?
Oh, you're asking me? Sorry.
Yeah. Was there something in particular that he was getting the crowd riled up about being fake news?
Well, he talked about the debates that he had with Kamala Harris, where where David Muir jumped in and said crime was down and not up, and he said he sort of claimed that actually crime was up and that he was vindicated the next day. So I'm not sure, and that's entirely true either, to be honest. But he sort of made a big show of the idea that the press was not fair, and that having a fair press was half the battle. He didn't sort of alight on that many specifics. He very often suggested that the press elided mistakes that Harris had made. There was a long sort of discourse about when apparently he said that her teleprompter had failed and that she'd almost had to stop speaking and had nothing to say and couldn't speak off the cuff. But of course, the media wouldn't report on that. It was that kind of thing, really. I wouldn't say sort of necessarily hugely substantive stuff, but yeah, I mean, he has always enjoyed attacking the press, and it's something that he does at most of his rallies.
Indeed. Okay, thanks so much for that update, Will. Really appreciate your time. Will Pavia there, the Times' New York correspondent who's just left the rally at Madison Square Garden. A historic moment for him, whatever happens in the election, as Will was saying, that he's returned to New York City. And even though some people have left early, and even though it did go on for ages, nonetheless, did have this triumphant return where you have a massive crowd of people who absolutely adore him. Matteo, I mean, listening to that, I was thinking about when Will was saying that Trump accuses the media of lying and false narratives being pushed, to be fair to him, there was something of a conspiracy of silence around Joe Biden's ability to string a sentence together, wasn't there, for some time, which probably didn't help. I mean, if you're predisposed to think that the other side, in this case, the Democrats or the Democrat-leaning news organizations, aren't being entirely honest about their prospects, there was a case right in front of us where you had someone who shouldn't be standing for president again because he didn't have the capacity to do it, and they were saying he was absolutely fine.
No, definitely. I think it's an interesting example, because do you, in that instance, blame the media or the people behind the then Joe Biden campaign? Because what was being reported on was effectively what the campaign was saying about him, rather than the media saying itself, oh, this person's fine, etc., etc.
Well, no, that's a classic thing that I do remember for many weeks, seeing footage on social media of Biden awkwardly shuffling around, facing the wrong direction when he was supposed to be talking to a crowd, taking ages getting down a flight of stairs and then forgetting where he was. I remember seeing all that on social media and not being reported in the mainstream media because I think people thought it was disrespectful, or they didn't want to speculate about his physical health. And then, 2 months later, hey presto, he's standing down.
I think he also called the president of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin.
He did that. That one did make that
at the NATO. Yeah. That one, I mean, of two names that you could confuse was but no, I think there is one thing where you are not reporting something or not making light of something because, as you say, it's potentially seen as disrespectful, and arguably maybe world leaders shouldn't be afforded the same respect as you would necessarily another individual that was going through health declines because of age or stress or whatever else. So I definitely think there is an element there, but that is different to saying that the news media are fake news, and the kind of the campaign of discreditation that has been going on basically since the Trump campaign kind of came into the political limelight. And that is part of the idea of, again, discrediting legacy voices or legacy organizations that have a track record of being factual in what they're attempting to report. For the most part, obviously, organizations make mistakes like anybody. But discrediting it completely to the point where, oh, these are propaganda machines or these are fake news machines that are pushing out, certain narratives, etc. Because what you're then doing, and what we see with a lot of disinformation campaigns, for example, it's not necessarily about making someone believe an alternate narrative. It's not the same as propaganda necessarily, but it's about discrediting any mode of information so that you kind of get into this nihilistic mentality that nothing you're hearing is true. No media is telling you the truth. So you've got to kind of go down to your basic biases and instincts. And that can be a very dangerous road, because then you go you come across someone that is saying all the kind of things that you want to hear, that you know, all your biases, that your internal biases that you never really show are kind of aligning with, and then you kind of respond positively to that. So I think the two are slightly different.
Let's get a bit of an update. David Katz is a US commentator, former assistant US attorney and federal prosecutor. David, thank you for staying up for us. How are you?
Great being with you, Rosie. In Los Angeles, it's only 10 p.m.
Okay, good. Good news. So why do you think, David, Donald Trump went to Madison Square Gardens, a state that he knows he's not going to win?
Well, part of it is an ego trip. He loves this thing about crowd size. And as you just said, Beyonce appeared in front of about 30,000 people, along with Kamala Harris. So part of it's an ego trip, and part of it is, yes, this spectacle that even in such a blue Democratic state and city as New York City and state are, that they could turn out 20,000 people. If you think about it, no matter how unpopular some group was in London, they could probably turn out 20,000 people. But to say they played the Palladium or whatever the equivalent is not only an ego trip, but it's more important, I think, for Harris, because when she turns out people, then she takes them to the polls. You see, we don't have election day anymore. We have a couple of weeks leading up to the election, and you can go vote early voting, so they can actually take followers to the polls. So when, let's say, Harris revs up thousands and thousands of people in some swing state, then they go to the polls and they either early vote or they send in their mail-in ballot. The reality is, as you reported, New York is lost for Trump. So I think things are trending a little bit toward Harris. And when she turns out, let's say, Bruce Springsteen in Philadelphia, you see what I'm saying? Thousands of people vote right on the heels of that. Nothing like that happened at Madison Square Garden, but it was an ego trip. And let me say one other thing, too. You said, Musk and Hulk Hogan. Those are not the grade A celebrities in the United States. Beyonce, Bruce Springsteen, the Obamas, you can say, and some of the other people who are appearing for Harris. Those are much more the celebrities. And then she's about to go to the Ellipse on Tuesday, and she's going to give a speech, Rosie, exactly where Trump gave his incendiary speech that incited the assault on the Capitol and the attempted coup here in America. So that will, I think, make her point again that, the threat to democracy, it will remind people that, the Ellipse, oh, my goodness, we are turning the page on that kind of coup violence that we had. So I think things are trending her way.
Kamala Harris has said that what happened overnight at sort of Donald Trump's rally, that the language was divisive and demeaning. She's talking about the fact that sort of Donald Trump's warm-up acts sort of risked overshadowing Donald Trump. Do you want to tell us what happened? Because the comedian Tony Hinchcliffe, he was invited to come up and sort of warm up the crowd ahead of Donald Trump. He referred to the US territory of Puerto Rico as a floating island of garbage. I mean, that's sort of the main messaging that's coming out. Donald Trump had to sort of distance himself from that, but you're not expecting to have to distance yourself from an endorsement of yourself.
Well, this wasn't unexpected. This so-called comedian had made these kind of awful, insulting statements before, and yet Trump invited him anyway. And, of course, a lot of politics, like law, is timing. And the timing was terrible for Trump because a lot of Puerto Rican people were meeting with Harris today. So she could exploit that immediately. And we're talking about the A-list celebrities who, here in the United States, are all supporting the Democratic ticket this time around. Jennifer Lopez, J-Lo, also is performing. The Bad Bunny, who has an enormous following. And, what happens to these things is they end up in clips, they end up on social media, and the Puerto Rican vote is a huge factor. It might even put Florida back in play, which is not one of the 7 swing states, but there's a large Puerto Rican community in Pennsylvania. And so, as I say, I think things are kind of trending her way. They thought that she had plateaued, but she's also made some efforts like with Liz Cheney, and these other Republicans. And I think there were a lot of Republicans and independents who are going to stay home. And again, it's bringing forth, January 6th, the marauding of the Capitol, that Trump wouldn't cede power. And that is very, very scary. You don't have anything like that in the United Kingdom, but it's really frightening over here. And then, of course, there's former 4-star General Kelly, who was the longest-serving aide in the White House, chief of staff to Trump. And he's now gone public because he's tired of getting lambasted And he said, look, I said these things, and I said them because they were true. And Trump said these things, that he admired a lot of things that Hitler had done. Hitler did a lot of good things, too. I mean, who on earth would say such a thing? And then these attacks on the enemies, you know, I don't think you have that in the United Kingdom either. I don't think you could run for dog catcher over there saying you were going to retaliate and take vengeance against all the people you didn't like in life.
There are so many ways we could compare the US election politics structure to the UK. I think a lot of us here kind of feeling relieved that it's not the same. David, thank you so much. David Katz.
I'm Andrew Neil. This is Times Radio, live from New York, with 9 days to go till US Election Day. Donald Trump's bid for a second term as US president peaked here in Manhattan last night with a massive rally in the iconic Madison Square Garden. Team Trump saw this as taking the campaign into the heartland of the enemy. New York State hasn't voted for a Republican presidential candidate since Ronald Reagan in 1984. They know it's a long shot for Trump, but it's not clear last night made it any less of a long shot. New York has a huge Puerto Rican population, so it was hardly helpful when a pro-Trump comedian, Tony Hinchcliffe, kicked off the rally like this.
It is absolutely wild times. It really, really is. And, you know, there's a lot going on. Like, I don't know if you guys know this, but there's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico.
But not content with mocking Jews, Palestinians and Hispanics, Mr. Hinchcliffe went on to call out a black man in the audience with a reference to watermelon. The irony is that Trump has been making inroads into the black and Hispanic votes like no other Republican candidate, much to the Democrats' consternation. But such is the somewhat chaotic nature of the Trump campaign, nobody had thought to vet the warm-up speaker's remarks. Another warm-up act likened Kamala Harris to a prostitute with, quote, pimp handlers. Yet another depicted her as the Antichrist. Tucker Carlson, the former Fox News bloviator turned shill for Trump, a man he once excoriated in private emails, mocked Harris, who has an Indian-Jamaican heritage. But to Carlson, she was a Samoan Malaysian with low IQ. Nope, I had no idea either. By the time Trump took to the stage, many long hours later, some of the audience had already drifted off. They continued to do so even as he spoke. Many were from out of town. The garden is over a massive railway station. No doubt many had trains to catch. Even as they left, Trump leant into what the New York Times this morning describes as a carnival of grievances, misogyny and racism, with rhetoric like this.
And I'm hereby calling for the death penalty for any migrant that kills an American citizen or a law enforcement officer. Under Kamala, America is a sanctuary for criminals and for illegal aliens that are in our country illegally. I will immediately ban all sanctuary cities in the United States.
Now, it's not clear if last night's somewhat bizarre rally will change anything. Trump has said many outrageous things himself in this campaign, and it doesn't seem to harm him. So maybe what his uncouth warm-up acts say won't either. Team Harris has a worried look in its eyes. You could see that on the Sunday morning talk shows yesterday across the US news networks. They hope, however, that the dawning realization that Trump could well be winning might galvanize the anti-Trump forces to flock to the polls. We'll see. Last night gave them plenty of ammunition to encourage the anti-Trumpers to do just that. But if Team Harris fails to do it, then it probably doesn't deserve to win on November the 5th anyway. This is Andrew Neil on Times Radio, live from New York. Let's start with a Republican perspective on last night and what now lies ahead in the next 9 days. Doug McKinnon is a Republican commentator, former White House and Pentagon official, former press secretary to Bob Dole. He was once a presidential candidate and former speechwriter for Presidents Reagan and George Bush Sr. Doug, let me begin with this. Donald Trump has been making inroads into the black and Hispanic vote, especially among black and Hispanic men, much to the Democrats' chagrin. On what planet does it make sense to have warm-up acts at your biggest rally yet making racist fun of both?
Yeah, Andrew, thanks for having me on. Obviously that comedian's just an idiot. He shouldn't have been there. And I agree with you. Maybe somebody should have done a better job of vetting him. But ultimately, that's going to have no effect on the Trump vote whatsoever. Again, this election is coming down to, and I've written about it a number of times here in the United States, to bread and butter issues, to national security, to economic security. It's one of the things even Axios, which is a news site that you know well here in Washington, D.C., just recently reported that more and more Democrats believe, unfortunately for them, that Kamala Harris is going to lose. And one of the reasons they were talking about, even my own paper, The Hill in Washington, D.C., also said, look, it's about Democratic hubris as opposed to anything else. When the Democrats themselves, meaning Democratic voters, say, look, we do want to talk about immigration. We do want to talk about the economy. We do want to talk about crime in our neighborhoods. And Kamala Harris and the Democrats continually ignore what their own voters want to talk about, then that becomes, unfortunately, an issue. And Trump has capitalized on all those issues.
I get the point, Doug, that if the campaign was more focused on bread and butter issues, then Trump would likely win. I mean, most folks, they answer the famous Reagan question, do you think you're less well off or better well off than 4 years ago? Most folks think that they are less well off. But Team Trump's had some job trying to get their man to focus on bread and butter issues rather than things that he rambles about, which aren't cutting through.
Well, but I disagree with that, Andrew, because he does talk about those issues quite a bit. Whether the left of center media reports that on their airwaves is another story entirely. But that is getting through. For instance, I was talking to a number of my blue-collar Democratic cousins and friends in my home state of Massachusetts. None of them who like President Trump's personality, but all of them just told me that basically they're going to vote for Trump because ultimately it's about their children and their grandchildren and about their economic security. And they're also worried about the world being on fire over the course of the last few years. And of course, for the United Kingdom, that's also a serious issue.
So you don't think that Team Trump should worry that the kind of thing we saw last night, and it was widely broadcast on prime time on a Sunday night, and of course all the breakfast shows in New York have been, across the country have been replaying it. You don't think that this kind of thing could galvanize those anti-Trumpers? They're anti-Trump, but they're not minded to vote, but they might well get off their sofas and go and vote now when they hear this, because it reminds them why they didn't vote for him in 2020.
Yeah, Andrew, I honestly don't believe it's going to have an effect because, again, I think the American voters are much brighter than some in the media are giving them credit for. And they understand, look, so here's this moron comedian that made some jokes. He's obviously a bigot. And it's one of those things where they're not going to connect that comedian to Trump. What they're going to connect to Trump is, again, the issues that he's been talking about for the last year and especially the last few months. And more importantly, the issues that Kamala Harris refuses to discuss. And it's even for members of the media, it's just amazing to them that she has not held a real press conference yet since she became the nominee. And again, the fact of the matter is that she is not good at speaking to reporters, and it makes her very nervous. And the voters realize that. They just want to have a better life. They want to have a better life for their children and grandchildren. And they believe ultimately that Trump is addressing those issues. We'll see what happens. I mean, I still believe that Trump's going to comfortably win on November 5th.
Democrats, never mind Republicans, never rated Kamala Harris. It was one reason why they didn't want to get rid of Joe Biden, at least until the famous debate. But I think she's turned out to be a better candidate than most thought, a better campaigner. Not great, not claiming that, but better than we thought, and at least good enough to make this a very tight race.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't think it's that tight ultimately. Again, sort of the polls always undercount the Trump vote. And to your point, Andrew, there are a number of Democrats that I've spoken with and a number of Democrats that you've probably spoken with and read about over the last few weeks and months that really did want to have an open convention. These are Democrats that wanted that.
Indeed, most of them did want it. They were just never given the chance.
They weren't, because guess what? They were big-footed by Barack Obama, by Nancy Pelosi, and by Chuck Schumer, and they had no chance to have an open convention. And I agree with you. There were a number of very strong Democratic candidates out there, but this isn't the ticket that most Democrats I know wanted. They didn't want Biden. They didn't want Harris, and that's what they're stuck with. And again, remember, I think what people are losing sight of, Andrew, is that in 2019, 2020, Kamala Harris was the first person out of that Democratic primary.
Sure.
Why?
Well, she didn't even make it to the primaries.
She didn't, because it folded and she started with a big flare. But the problem is, the more people heard her, and this is on the Democratic side of the equation, the less they liked her. And some of that is translating now into the general election.
Trump is a hard man to run against because he is kind of unique. There's never, ever been a candidate for president like this in the history of the Republic. And he's hard because he lives off it's a kind of cult of personality that he campaigns on. Should the Democrats have fought a different campaign given what they were up against?
Andrew, I think that's a great point, and it's something I've written about a few times here in the United States. And you look at sort of the Republican primary, right? Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida. You know, he ran against Donald Trump. And to your point, he didn't realize he was running against a cult of personality, or at least he didn't give it enough thought, because Trump comes into this election season with tens of millions of votes in his back pocket. And it's one of these things he has, whether people want to admit it or not on the left, he has an it factor. He really does. And to your point, this is someone that comes along very, very rarely. And that actually does make a difference in how people look at him and again, what he brings to the table in terms of power. And he has capitalized on that it factor in a big way. And it's also hurting Kamala Harris.
Let me ask you this, Doug. The Republicans have a narrow majority in the House. The Democrats barely have a majority in the Senate. If you're right, if there's a fair win behind Trump, if he's going to win and just not squeak through, I think you said earlier you thought he might win quite comfortably in the end. Not a landslide, I know you're not talking about that, but relatively comfortably. He's not going to be just a smidgen. If that's true, do the Republicans take the House and the Congress and the Senate, both houses? Is it a clean sweep?
I believe they will, Andrew, because, again, I think his coattails are going to be longer than anybody wants to admit right now. And, you know, to your point, is it going to be my old boss, George H.W. Bush in 1988, is it going to be that kind of landslide? No. But is it going to be sort of what they're talking about now is if you have basically a 100 electoral vote margin in terms of you, then that is a mini landslide now. And I believe Trump's going to meet that mark. And if he does, then I think he brings the House and the Senate along with him.
I guess, though, if you're a moderate Republican or a non-Trump Republican or an independent, some moderate in the middle, suburban mom or something like that, you might think, okay, well, Trump's going to win the White House again. Not so sure about that. I better vote Democrat for the House and the Senate, so that at least there's some balance in the different sectors of the government in Washington.
I mean, you see that sometimes, obviously, Andrew, you're right. You know, are we going to split the ticket just because we happen to, like this person better, for our district or for our state? But I don't believe in terms of this now because of the agenda and what's going on, and because it's so clearly defined between both parties, right? Between both candidates. And so I think if people are going to vote for Trump, then they're also going to probably vote for a Republican representative in their state as well.
Okay, Doug, we'll leave it there. Thanks for joining us this morning. Been good to talk to you. I say morning because I'm in New York. Doug McKinnon there, Republican commentator, former aide to Presidents Reagan and H.W. Bush. Kamala Harris and her running mate Tim Walz will barnstorm all 7 battleground states this week in a final get-out-the-vote effort starting today in Michigan, where Harris hasn't been doing too well and needs to improve. She spent yesterday crisscrossing Philadelphia. It's the biggest city in that swingiest of swing states, Pennsylvania. The city's rock-solid Democrat, but she's hoping to boost turnout, especially among blacks and Hispanics, to give her the edge statewide. Harris has called Trump a fascist and a threat to democracy, par for the course in a campaign notable for its intemperate language on both sides. She's even using some of the lines Team Trump used against Joe Biden, flipping them against Trump himself as too old and not mentally alert. But is it cutting through? Some of the Harris campaign fear not, but other Democrats are more optimistic. Let's speak now to Tom Bonnier, senior advisor at Target Smart. It analyzes U.S. political data. Tom, welcome. Let me start with this. There was a growing conviction last week, even among Democrats, and you saw it in the Democratic media, that the Harris campaign had failed to keep up its early momentum. There were signs that she was sort of the kind of lead that she needed over Trump to avoid defeat in the Electoral College. A lot of people still think that, but you don't. Explain why.
Well, for a few reasons. I mean, one, I'm a Democrat. This is my 30th year working in Democratic politics. I've been here before. It wouldn't be in October in an even number year if you didn't have a lot of nervous Democrats who are convinced somehow that the campaign is blowing it this time. What we do is we focus on the actual data. And when you look at the polling in this race, it's actually been remarkably stable. Usually you see the polling jumping around, a lot of lead changes. But nationally, when you look at the average of the polls, Vice President Harris has a narrow lead, but a fairly consistent lead. And she has a narrow but consistent lead in enough states to get to 270 electoral votes. It by no means she has this wrapped up. It certainly also doesn't mean that she's blowing the race in any way.
The problem with depending on the polls, though, is that for both Mr. Trump and Ms. Harris, their leads in the swing states are decimal points. You know, in some it's 0.5, it's 0.6. You and I both know there's no way the polling is that accurate. And the Trump people still think the pollsters don't know how fully to count the blue-collar Trump voters, the shy Trumpers.
Yeah, you know, you've got two sides of this argument where, as you say, the Trump campaign and Republicans say, look, Donald Trump has been on the ballot twice, and twice the polls have underestimated his support. Democrats say, true, but since the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade, which was just a little over 2 years ago, Democrats have consistently outperformed polls. And in fact, in the 2022 elections, the midterm elections 2 years ago, the average poll missed by 5 points, which is a pretty big miss when you think about the margins that you were just talking about. And that was overwhelmingly overestimating Republicans. The last point that I'll make on this is, though they say that Donald Trump always overperforms his polls, the one time he didn't was in the presidential primaries this year, where in 19 out of 20 states where they had enough polls for these poll averages, Donald Trump actually dramatically underperformed his polls in these primaries. Now, we can't compare primaries to generals exactly, but the fact is there is a record of that happening. We know the political world did change dramatically after the Dobbs decision. So both sides have an argument to make here.
It's certainly true in the midterms in 2022, Trump underperformed in the sense that the people Trump backed didn't do that well. That's why there wasn't a red wave, whereas the Republicans that Trump didn't back actually did pretty well. So I can understand that. But to what extent is the prospect of a Trump victory? Because that I hear what you're saying, but the flaky consensus, if I can put it that way, is still that Trump will probably win. I'm not saying I necessarily share that, but that's where we are at the moment. To what extent that might galvanize people who don't like Trump but weren't thinking of voting to think, hey, this guy looks like he can win, I better go and vote for Harris?
Well, it's certainly one of the theories at this point from Democrats having lived through the 2016 election with an expectation that Hillary Clinton was going to cruise to victory, and it didn't happen. And we know in that case, a lot of Democrats stayed home because they thought she had it won. A number of Democrats actually voted for third-party candidates, Green Party candidates especially, because, again, they thought they could do it and it was safe and they wouldn't be losing the election. In 2020, it was almost worse, surprisingly, and that a lesson wasn't learned. The polls were actually more in Joe Biden's favor, and we know how that turned out. The polls were dramatically underestimating Trump's support. So I think there's less of a risk of that happening, though we do have short memories. We see how people actually view the Trump presidency much more favorably now that they're not living in the midst of it. So I don't think it's necessarily harmful that there is a perception that this is a very close race and that perhaps Vice President Harris has some ground to make up.
What do you make of something like the Madison Square Garden rally last night? And the reason I ask is to put it in a British context. There was a famous Labour Party rally in the 1992 election. Neil Kinnock was then the Labour candidate. It was called the Sheffield rally, and it was very much an American-style razzmatazz rally in Sheffield itself. And Kinnock blew it that night by being too triumphant, shouting, come on, and all right. And British people just didn't like that, and it turned against him. But it doesn't seem to work that way in the United States.
It doesn't. It's certainly one of the distinctions between y'all and us. But I do think something that, and we'll see in the closing week here, but when you looked at the polling over the past year, and what I mentioned a moment ago, that people have sort of created this halo effect around Donald Trump and view him more favorably. Now, and don't get me wrong, they still don't view him all that favorably. But part of that's just because he was out of the public consciousness and out of the public eye. He largely wasn't around. The focus was on President Biden, and then the focus was on Vice President Harris. And what we found is the more that he is in the public eye, the more people are reminded that they're just exhausted by these sorts of things. When we see the racist jokes that were coming out of, that frankly were not jokes, out of the rally.
Well, you're right. They weren't jokes.
Night.
They weren't jokes at all. They were just offensive.
No, they're just offensive racist statements. And so to see those, I think, is a reminder for a lot of Americans of exactly what they didn't like about the 4 years of the Trump presidency. So I'm not sure it was the smartest move, though. You know, Donald Trump, these decisions are about ego. They're generally not about strategy. I think we give him a little bit too much credit as being a strategist.
Tom, it's 9 days to go. You look at the data, which is always useful. Having studied it, how would you advise Harris to fight these final days? What should she do, and what should her closing message be?
Well, look, they've built an incredibly strong campaign. They've raised more resources than any campaign ever has, and they did it in a fraction of the time anyone did. I think they're running an incredibly smart campaign. They've built a campaign around this moment, around this last week, in a close race, whereas the Trump campaign hasn't done that. We know a lot of the resources they've raised, which are significantly less than the Harris campaign, have gone to pay Donald Trump's legal bills. He bankrupted the Republican National Committee, the National Party. He outsourced the turnout efforts to Elon Musk. They have a lot of significant issues. So I think what we're seeing is the Harris campaign closing with strength. And so that message of strength, and frankly, a more aspirational message that we are better than this as Americans, is the right closing message, and it's what you're seeing from them.
Change days, Tom. I've covered every presidential election since Carter v. Ford in 1976, and for many of the years I've covered elections, it's always been the Republicans had the most money and the Democrats struggled to catch up. Now the Democrats have got a ton more money than the Republicans. American politics has stood on its head.
It very much is. It's quite unusual. I think a lot of people were surprised when they saw that $1 billion number that came out. It's entirely unprecedented, but it shows the sort of enthusiasm and excitement that, again, at least from the Harris campaign side, they're arguing that this is what isn't showing up in the polls, that there's more excitement, enthusiasm, and intensity among Democrats. It showed up in the fundraising. It's showing up in the early voting now. It showed up in new voter registration data. Will it show up next Tuesday? That's the final question to answer.
Well, before we had you on, Tom, we had a Republican strategist, and he said he thought Mr. Trump would not just win, but win reasonably comfortably. Not a landslide, he wasn't predicting that, but it would be more than just a smidgen. How do you see things, Tom?
Well, I'm not in the business of making predictions because it's a good way to look foolish. But in the end, as you say, when the polls show this within a point one way or the other, and we think about when in 2022, as I said, the average poll missed by 5 points, and we were actually told after the fact that was a pretty good year for polling. Well, that means either candidate is capable of winning by a fairly large electoral college vote margin. I think it's less likely for Donald Trump because he just doesn't have that same sort of path. And again, we haven't seen the intensity and enthusiasm from Republicans since the Dobbs decisions like we have seen from Democrats. So I think that favors the Harris campaign in terms of their ability to potentially do something winning by a larger margin than the polls would suggest.
We've only 9 days to find out. Well, I say only 9. Could be quite a few days after November the 5th before we know for sure. But Tom, we'll leave it there. Tom Bonnier, Democratic analyst. When he said there, I never make predictions, I thought he was going to quote Alex Ferguson saying, I don't make predictions and I never will. But he didn't, probably just as well. And in a very close presidential contest, it's possible the loser, whether Republican or Democrat, will contest the result with multiple court actions. Both sides are already lawyered up to the hilt, and I mean the hilt. Hundreds of lawyers have been signed up and thousands more legal volunteers. There's even speculation of a constitutional crisis if the election is slow or close, and inevitably it could all end up with the Supreme Court. Let's speak now to Professor Larry Kramer, Vice-Chancellor of the London School of Economics, former Dean of Stanford Law School, an expert on the court. Professor, thanks for joining us. is it fair to assume, given some might say the bad example set in 2020, that if the winner just scrapes over the line this time, there will be multiple court challenges from the loser, especially in the swing states?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair guess. The really bad example, of course, was set in 2000, but we've been living with that one ever since.
That was the hanging chads in Florida.
Yeah.
So the Electoral College, so the country goes to the polls on November the 5th, either that night or probably more likely someday after we get an idea of what the result is. The court challenges could then come in fast and thick. The Electoral College votes, which choose the president, they're meant to be counted by January the 6th. The new president officially declared. If there's an avalanche of litigation, could that deadline be missed?
So again, anything could happen is the answer. I doubt it would happen because of an avalanche of litigation, though, only in the sense that the courts have been pretty good about handling the cases quickly. So there will undoubtedly be an avalanche of litigation. It will start before all the votes have been counted, because they're counted at different paces in different states, and some of them go on quite some time. So the litigation will probably start right after. But I would be surprised if courts didn't get through the cases in time.
And they did last time. I mean, they had over 60 cases, and some of them they threw out right away, others they dealt with quickly. Professor, when would the Supreme Court, if it does, when would it come into play?
So again, it kind of is up to the court. All of this is extremely unpredictable, is the short answer.
I understand.
We've had it happen a little bit. I think what we're likely or could see this time will make, what happened earlier look like early dress rehearsals, not even sort of well along the way. So it's going to be a little hard to tell. It's also hard to tell because the court has the capacity to reach down if need be and take cases and bring them up sooner or speed up the process. And
so the court can initiate action itself. It doesn't have to wait for someone to go to the court.
It can't exactly initiate the action itself, but parties can ask it to move faster, and they can skip steps, reach down all the way to a trial court. And again, you can assume parties will do whatever they need to in terms of trying to use the process to their advantage. So every option that exists is likely to be used, which is what makes it also unpredictable.
You mentioned the 2000 election, which was very close between Mr. Bush and Mr. Gore. The Supreme Court's ruling on Florida, I think at the time, was thought to be quite partisan, if I can put it that way. I guess that could happen again.
So even if it isn't partisan, it's going to seem partisan because it's going to have an outcome. And whoever loses is going to always think that the court has acted in a partisan manner. In fact, there's no question, I think, that it is partisan. The judges are judges. They're also people. They feel very strongly. The issues seem high, and they're in the middle of this maelstrom, which makes it really hard to maintain your objectivity. On this court, you've got at least a couple of the older justices who already have essentially all but thrown off any pretense of being anything other than partisan. That's only a couple of them, but it's enough to create a really strong sense. And as I say, I think it's a lot to ask anybody sitting in the middle of that I don't even know how you could put aside your partisan feelings. So there's no way of really escaping it.
I understand. In 2020, Mr. Trump claimed that the vice president, who was handling the vote to the Electoral College votes on January the 6th, the day of the famous mob riot, of course, the vice president then was Mike Pence. Mr. Trump and his advisors claimed that the vice president had the power to strike down a state's slate for the Electoral College. I think the legal consensus among scholars like yourself was that wasn't true. And am I right in thinking there's been a bipartisan law since passed which clarifies the position of the vice president when it comes to the Electoral College?
Yes, that's right. The law has been amended in a number of ways so that the kind of mess that you had last time won't happen this time. Among other things, yes, they made crystal clear that the vice president's job is just to open the envelopes and not to exercise any discretion in deciding whether they should be admitted or not.
And of course, the vice president this time will be someone called Kamala Harris.
Kamala Harris, yeah.
She can hardly, if she's lost narrowly, it'd be quite difficult for her to strike that down, I would have thought, politically.
Yeah, one would think so.
If there is, however, it goes the other way, if there is a Harris administration, she will face what I think Democrats will regard as a hostile Supreme Court. And I see talk that maybe the Supreme Court should be reformed. I think I'm right in saying, Professor, that the number of judges is not fixed in the Constitution, that Congress could change the number. You could add more Democrats. What chances do you think that she could try and pack the court?
Yes. So first, there are a number of ways in which by law you can change the composition of the court. You can add justices, but you can change their jurisdiction. You can slash their budget. There's all sorts of possibilities and ways in which to discipline a court. Those have actually been used across American history in a number of instances, but there's essentially zero chance of them being used this time because they require a statute to be passed by Congress. And you're not going to get a statute through Congress. In the best of all possible worlds, the Democrats maybe retain one house, but not both. And even if they manage somehow to get both houses, they will not have a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate.
So it would be very hard to get through Congress. I think the last president seriously to consider changing the composition of the court was FDR in the 1930s, when a lot of his New Deal legislation was thwarted by the court. Though the threat of a change, I think in the end, the Supreme Court kind of roughly fell in line.
Not roughly, they absolutely fell in line. They flipped
I was trying to be
exactly
polite.
in the way that he wanted. And then about 2 weeks later, one of them retired and he was able to appoint somebody. There have been other efforts since then. They just never kind of got off the ground. And the issues were not as profoundly, divisive within the political system that a president felt the need to really push it the way FDR did.
Is the American judiciary, partly because part of it's elected, parts of it are chosen by politicians, like the Supreme Court, it's always been more politicized than, say, the British judiciary. But is it more politicized now than ever before?
So yes. So first, the federal bench versus the state benches. You have direct elections and so on of judges at the state court level. The federal bench are all they're nominated by presidents and approved by Congress. So it's necessarily something that goes through the political process, but it's become much, much, much more politicized as the power of the court has grown and the stakes of, who's on the court, become much greater. So it started to change and become much, much more controversial back in the 50s after Brown v. the Board of Education, but really took off after the Bork nomination in 1986, which was the one in which really was brought home to the American public that who you put on the bench matters because they're going to have final say over important rights of yours. That wasn't really deep in the political culture prior to then. And then since then, every nomination for the Supreme Court is a huge big deal, but even nominations for the lower courts are quite political.
Well, about 5.8 million people who were born in Puerto Rico live in the US, and there are significant numbers of Puerto Ricans in the battleground state of Pennsylvania. Trump himself did not comment on the offensive remarks about the country, but he did step up his commitment to crack down on immigration, promising the largest deportation program in American history and attacking his opponent, Kamala Harris.
Over the past 4 years, Kamala Harris has orchestrated the most egregious betrayal that any leader in American history has ever inflicted upon our people. She has violated her oath, eradicated our sovereign border, and unleashed an army of migrant gangs who are waging a campaign of violence and terror against our citizens.
Well, there were more personal attacks on Kamala Harris. Another of the speakers, Trump's former personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, accused her of siding with terrorists.
The Palestinians are taught to kill us at 2 years old. They won't let a Palestinian in Jordan. They won't let a Palestinian in Egypt. And Harris wants to bring them to you. They may have good people. I'm sorry I don't take a risk with people that are taught to kill Americans at 2. I'm on the side of Israel. You're on the side of Israel. Donald Trump's on the side of Israel. And they're on the side of the terrorists.
Well, Kamala Harris herself had this response to that rally.
I think last night Donald Trump's event in Madison Square Garden really highlighted a point that I've been making throughout this campaign. He is focused and actually fixated on his grievances, on himself, and on dividing our country. And it is not in any way something that will strengthen the American family.
Well, Well, Fred Trump is Donald Trump's nephew and author of All in the Family, The Trumps and How We Got This Way. And he joins us now. Good evening to you, Fred.
Good evening. How are you?
Very well, and good to have you with us tonight. Let me just begin by asking you what you make of that rally, a big occasion for the Trump campaign in Madison Square Garden in New York. Does Donald Trump need to do more to distance himself or even to denounce some of the comments that were made?
First of all, he doesn't have the courage to denounce those comments, and I'm sure he was cheering them on. If whatever it takes to get his crowd, his base ramped up, he's all for it. So you won't see him denouncing it at all.
I mean, you have been quite outspoken in your criticism of Donald Trump. Do you agree with what we heard from Kamala Harris there, that he is focusing on division?
Oh, sure. And I predicted this when the book came out on July 30th. This was just going to become a nasty race to the bottom with him. And he's proving it day after day after day, not just his personal attacks on Kamala Harris, but calling America a garbage pail. America is the greatest country in the world. And he has to prove his worth to his base again, that America is a lousy country and only he can fix it. Well, he didn't do such a great job the last time.
When you were growing up, did you ever expect your Uncle Donald, to become president of the United States?
No, certainly not. Not even as short ago as 10 years ago. Never thought it could happen. He dabbled in politics for years. So that was mostly for business reasons. And he came close in 2011, but decided against it. So the answer for me is no. I really didn't expect it up until, as I detail in the book, when Barack Obama started roasting him at the Correspondents' Dinner in 2015. That really set him off to run.
So you think it was those comments from Barack Obama that first inspired him for his first run at the presidency?
Yes, I absolutely do. Donald does not like to be ridiculed. He doesn't like to be labeled a loser. And he was by Obama, and people were laughing at him, and that sets him off the wall. And I in the room I'm in right now, I was with my wife watching that night, and I said, Obama just awoke the sleeping giant, and the rest, unfortunately, was history.
Donald Trump, like yourself, was, of course, a businessman. What made you decide to write this book, which does expose quite a lot of detail about your family and about Donald Trump?
Yes, very quickly. Originally, the book was to be written by my wife, Lisa, and I. We thought about it in 2018. Our young son, William, has complex disabilities, and we wanted to pretty much write a detailed book on what we did with William and how we advanced him through these most difficult years. When Donald started running in 2015, William was still living at home. Our two older children were living in Manhattan. And we started having dead animals thrown on our lawn, reporters coming up to our house unannounced. So we didn't want to say anything at that time. And the more I thought about the book, I saw the parallels between my father and William. And I thought that would be a great story. And to do that, I needed to tell the story in a much more nuanced way than other books that are out there. This is a personal account. These are not, stories from someone who may have worked with Donald for 5 minutes or, not having met him at all. And it was also January 6th, 2021, that I saw such a demonic change in Donald that I also didn't anticipate. But his need to always win was the driving force behind that. And he put a lot of people in danger. He put the country in danger. So I needed to give an accounting of my lifetime experiences with Donald to see how he led to this point in his life.
January the 6th, of course, was the occasion of the riot at the Capitol building. But you have been and are still very, very critical of Donald Trump. Other members of your family have been very actively involved in advising him and, of course, actually taking part in his campaign for re-election. How difficult has it been for you to deal with that and to deal with what is now apparently quite a significant rift in your family?
Yes, it is. And I anticipated that. But the other family members, namely my cousins, they really had no choice but to back their father. And on one level, I want to say, okay, that's great. That's loyalty. But he's pushing this country into a dangerous position. I had a choice, and I chose what I thought was best for the country, and not just saying I would vote for Kamala Harris, but I will campaign on her behalf if I'm asked in the last 7.5 days. She's the only one to keep us moving forward in our country and keeping our democracy intact.
And have you spoken to Donald Trump, to your uncle, in person? Have you talked to him about what you clearly see as the mistakes that he's making?
No, I have not. After he said what he did about my son, William, that he should just die because of his disabilities, that was a bridge too far for me. I did reach out during the first assassination attempt to say that Lisa and I and the kids were thinking about him, and glad that he was okay, and that we wished him a speedy recovery from his injury.
Just to pick you up on that comment, so your son William, who is severely disabled, you're saying that Donald Trump suggested that he should die?
Yes, we had a medical fund set up for William, and I asked Donald some questions about it, and he just said, "Your son doesn't recognize you, let him die, and move down to Florida." To which I responded, "He does recognize me, Donald, and he recognizes everybody in his life." Donald has never met William and never asked to meet William. So the fact that he could come and say that William didn't recognize me is a pretty ridiculous statement.
Have you had much of a backlash from other members of the Trump family who, as we've said, are much closer to Donald Trump?
Just the typical rejoinders from them that it's all lies, and I did this just for the money, and it's just nonsense. It was totally expected. They do it all the time.
But you must have known when you wrote this book that you were going to get that backlash, not just from other members of your family, but from millions of Trump supporters across the country who've accused you of being embittered, of bearing a grudge, and so on.
I'm not bitter. I'm sorry that this happened with my family. As I say, it's a very nuanced accounting. I tell stories of my good times with Donald throughout the years. And we share the passion with golf. In fact, he taught me how to play golf. We're both relentless. But I had more of an important mission ahead, and that is what is leading me now to be a vocal advocate on behalf of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Lisa and I just started a foundation called williamsjourney.org, and we're going to use this platform to speak out for a large population, not just in this country, the United States, but in all countries. Each country I am interviewed in, the UK, Australia, India, the Middle East, the disability issue is becoming the forefront. And I'm sorry when Donald supporters will make their comments on Facebook or whatever and just trash me. I'm trying to use this as a platform for doing good stuff.
And this race for the White House is clearly neck and neck, too close to call, according to most who are following this race very closely. Do you think Donald Trump is heading for another term in the White House?
You're absolutely right. It is as close as can be, certainly as close as any election I've been around, and I've been voting since 1980. We're just going to have to see. But if anyone's expecting a result on November 6th or 7th, just get a lot of tea boiling, because it's going to take days, if not weeks, if not months, for this to be cleared up.
And what do you think another term in the White House for Donald Trump, if he does win, if he does return to the White House, what do you think that would mean for the United States? And of course, for your personal campaign there for more help and more support for people with disabilities?
Yeah, well, I think it'll be a very dangerous time, and I don't want to be hyperbolic. It's going to be a time of retribution. His Project 2025, for anybody who's not read it, I urge you to Google it. Right in the forward, if it wants to get rid of the Department of Education, which means minority kids in this country are going to have a lesser education. People with disabilities who are children and who get therapies and services through schools, that's going to be diminished. That's just one thing. The migrant issue of being able to just ask anybody who looks like they're from a foreign country for their documents and the ability to send them out of the country. It's a place that I never thought could happen, a place that we may be going that I don't think many people thought was possible.
So you fear that those deep divisions that we've seen in US society could be made worse?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
In what way?
It's going to be a very contentious time between a group of people who are totally enthralled and follow him lock, stock, and barrel and would do anything for him. It's going to divide the country even more than it is now. It's going to be a very, very bad time, I'm afraid. And again, I don't mean to sound hyperbolic, and I'm certainly not the only one who holds this view.
Fred Trump, Donald Trump's nephew, author of All in the Family, The Trumps and How We Got This Way.
It's finally crept up, this incredibly important, incredibly close, incredibly weird election. How do you judge it a week out?
Well, this is a really exciting time. I've been involved in many elections, and the final week is unbelievable in some ways. Of course, we should keep in mind a lot of votes have already been cast. I don't know what the exact number is, but it's an unusual situation. So a certain high percentage is already in the bank, so to speak. But of course, what happens in the next few days is critical, and Election Day itself remains the single most important day. It's really a nail biter. I hate to use that expression, but it truly is. Most of the experts I've listened to and talked to really can't make a flat out prediction. It's very different from 2016 when it did seem that Hillary Clinton was going to win. Ultimately, of course, didn't. That's made everyone really gun shy about predictions, I think.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because that inability to spot the Trump vote in 2016, does that mean people are overstating the Trump vote in 2024? I've seen some Democrats clinging to hope to say, well, hang on a second, we've seen what happened in 2020, we've seen what happened in 2016. We think there might be an overstatement of the Trump vote somewhere along the line, or is that just people clinging to hope if they're on the Democrat side of the ball?
Well, there's two sides to that coin. One question is there a hidden Trump vote that'll come out again like they did in 2016, or is there a hidden Kamala Harris vote, which would perhaps be women coming out in greater numbers, including younger women? Does that happen, or do both happen? In which case it really is a jump ball. I think the pollsters have tried to correct for what happened in 2016, but the question is, as you suggest, maybe did they overcorrect or not? Some of these voters are just hard to reach in polls. It's hard to get people to answer cell phone calls, so it's a bit of an inscrutable mystery.
And that's why it really is genuinely, you think it's unknown, because we've come to rely on polls in this country. And actually, if you look at the polls in our last general election, they were pretty wrong. But because the overall message was Labour were going to win and Labour did win, the Labour vote was really overstated in the polls. But our electoral system meant that Labour will win. And because the margins were so great, it didn't really matter. But the polls were fundamentally not that close. So presumably in an election that's much tighter, not close polls really mean we're in the dark.
Yeah, and I think it'll remain that way. And as I mentioned, I think people are going to be afraid to be too conclusive about it. I think you're going to see a continued close race in the battleground states. I think one thing to watch is where does each candidate spend the majority of their time over the next 7-8 days, because that they're going to have the best polling. They're really round the clock at this point. And so as you watch them finalize their schedules, where are they going? Because that could tell you the tale of where it's closest.
What do you make of the last couple of days? I suppose the legacy of that Trump rally in Madison Square Garden has been the Puerto Rico joke by the comedian. The Latino community was seen as quite an important constituency. Trump has done historically pretty well in ethnic communities compared to the Democrats, compared to history, at least. Do you see that moving the dial at all?
Well, I think those insider polls may tell that tale as to whether the votes are shifting. I happen to know two women who are Puerto Rican who were at the rally. They personally weren't offended by it, but of course there's a larger narrative happening here, and some Democrats hope that Tony Hinchcliffe is the James Comey of 2024. I don't think he looms that large because he's a comedian. He's not the candidate himself, but it gave the Harris campaign something to latch onto for a couple days. I don't think it'll have a lasting effect, but we'll see. It's a very close race. A little bit can go a long way. But I'd be kind of surprised if it's still in the storyline come 3 or 4 days from now.
It's interesting you spoke to two Puerto Rican women. What did they say that was just it's a joke from a comedian and therefore it's got nothing to do with Trump?
Yeah, it was like 5 hours before Trump spoke. He's I guess I don't really know who he is, but he's apparently known for his outrage comedy. And if I was running that rally, I wouldn't have let him speak. But that's not me. And so it's obviously, I think it was obviously a mistake. He shouldn't have said what he said. And I'm sure privately, at least, Trump is not happy about it. But nonetheless, it'll be interesting to see what Kamala Harris has to say in Washington tomorrow, because she's obviously going to the place where Trump had his rally in January 6th. And will she concentrate on Trump yet again, or will she try to shift and explain more about what she stands for? Because I think that's a missing ingredient for her campaign.
Well, we're speaking to someone on the program today who has worked in government for 30 years, didn't vote Trump the last 2 times, but is voting Trump because he thinks the Democrats, he's voting against the Democrats. He's making the case that actually Trump is kind of mad, and but the systems of government will be a check on him because he's not their person. And actually that's better than voting in a Democrat who is going to try and control life, is going to try and be that sort of, in a word I think he would probably use, woke approach to the world. And therefore it's a vote against the Democrats rather than a vote for Trump. And presumably there's a risk in this election that everyone is voting against something rather than voting for something.
Yeah, I think that's true. Somebody mentioned that for 3 straight elections, both parties have offered candidates who frankly are not the favorite of the public. And so people have been somewhat dissatisfied with the choices they've been given. And there's also a bit of a reversal happening between the two parties. The Republicans used to be the party of more of the elites, and I think the Democrats have moved in the direction of being the party of the elites, whereas the Republicans are sort of moving more towards the middle and working class. And so that's kind of shifting some of the dynamics of a race like this, making it even more unpredictable, because there is a bit of a growing elite divide between college-educated people and non-college educated.
We see that in this country as well, I think, actually. Jim, just finally, how sanguine are you about that this will, whatever happens, this will go okay for democracy? I mean, I think I saw a poll that up to a quarter of Americans think this could lead to civil war. I'm not entirely sure how that would actually happen. But how confident are you that by November 6th we'll have a winner? Maybe November 8th, maybe November 10th, maybe December, that the winner will be accepted. Tell us how you're feeling about democracy.
Well, I feel pretty good about democracy. I don't think either way that's at high risk. Personally, I was involved in the 2000 campaign, of course, and so I was in the middle of that drama. But it wasn't, I mean, democracy kind of worked its way through the system. I think in that case, personally, I felt the Supreme Court made an erroneous decision, but nonetheless, we respected it and it was over. But it did take a number of weeks. I think this time, some people think that if Trump is winning winning, that'll be apparent fairly early in the evening on election night. But if Harris is winning, that may take a while to kind of sort out how the votes are landing.
But that's a problem, isn't it, Jim? So I remember in 2020, I remember coming into the studio at 3:00 in the morning, and because Trump, as predicted, was doing well early, that set the narrative that Biden stole the election. But actually, if you just reverse the order of states, no one would have said Biden stole the election. So that could be a problem, I guess.
Yeah, and in a state like Pennsylvania, for example, they do not start counting the votes, the early votes or the absentee votes, until the end of the polls have closed, and so you're not going to get all those votes counted early in the day, and that presents a problem, particularly if it does come down to one state like Pennsylvania, and it might. That result wouldn't be known until sometime in the next day, perhaps.
In 2000, the world was the world not a nicer place, a more polite, a more adherent to social norms place than it is in 2024, Jim? It might not have felt like that when you were working on the campaign, but is that not a lesson that we can't rely on what happened in 2000 because the world of social media didn't exist then, and it's a meaner old place now, Jim? Do you buy that argument?
Yeah, well, there was the so-called Brooks Brothers riot in one of the counting places in Florida. It wasn't exactly a riot, but there was some physical activity happening that was inappropriate. So there was a little bit of that, but most of it played out in courtrooms and news conferences, and so that's ideally what happens, in the future. But there may be marches and so forth, but I'm not ultimately too worried about whether the system will work or not. I do hope we do find out, in a pretty good amount of time, because the longer it does drag out, the more difficult it'll be to get one side or the other to accept what's happening.
Oh, that's very, very fairly put. Jim, great to speak to you as ever. We look forward to carrying on the conversation as we get closer and closer to the election. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much.
The US Vice President Kamala Harris is setting out the closing arguments of her presidential campaign tonight with a big speech at the site of Donald Trump's rally on January the 6th, 2021, before that violent attack on the US Capitol. She's expected to accuse her rival of trying to deepen the divisions in American society. Trump himself is also about to address a campaign rally in the battleground state of Pennsylvania. The former president spoke to reporters at his Mar-a-Lago ranch earlier and defended the controversial event he held at Madison Square Gardens in New York, where some of the warm-up acts made racist remarks.
At Madison Square Garden, the love in that room, it was breathtaking, and you could have filled it many, many times with the people that were unable to get in. But politicians that have been doing this for a long time, 30 and 40 years, said there's never been an event so beautiful. It was like a love fest, an absolute love fest, and it was my honor to be involved.
Well, David Charter is the US Assistant Editor for The Times. Good evening, David.
Good evening, Carol, from Washington, D.C.
Great to have you with us. Let's start with the Vice President, Kamala Harris. She is due on stage anytime now to deliver what is a really important speech, isn't it, tonight?
Yeah, this is being billed as her big closing argument speech, and it's been arranged with the visuals in mind. She's at the exact same spot where Donald Trump stood on January the 6th, 2021, and spoke to a very large crowd of his supporters before a lot of them marched off down to the US Capitol, and some of them, of course, rioted there, broke in, rampaged through the halls of Congress. So it's designed to show her as presidential. With it's dark now, the White House is lit up behind her. It's gonna look pretty stunning. The question is, and there, I should say, there's an enormous crowd, estimated at between 40 and 50,000. The ellipse area, which is the fenced-off part of the lower park beneath the White House, is full, and so the crowd has spilled out onto the mall, the very large grassy area in the middle of Washington. But the question is, how will the rest of America perceive it? Will they see her as presidential, or will they see her as a creature of Washington, supported by the Capitol, because there's a massive turnout here, probably the biggest crowd of the whole election for any rally. And could that backfire? Could it make her look like the establishment candidate when the country wants the insurgency, really, that's the Donald Trump campaign?
Well, Donald Trump himself tonight is going to be in Pennsylvania, and he's speaking in an area which has got a lot of Latino voters after that hugely controversial event at the weekend in Madison Square Gardens, where some of the remarks, they were from the warm-up acts, not from Trump himself, were frankly pretty offensive, in particular to Puerto Ricans.
Yes, there was a reminder, perhaps, of the Trump presidency, with a joke from a comedian about Puerto Rico being a floating island of garbage in the ocean. And Trump, well, first of all, he said he was holding a press conference today at Mar-a-Lago, which turned out to be another hour-long speech from Trump, actually with some very powerful messages from bereaved mothers whose daughters have been killed allegedly by migrants. But there was no apology. This is pretty normal for Trump. There was no looking back at the controversy at that press conference, and there were no questions. It wasn't much of a press conference. But he has mentioned elsewhere that he, again, characteristically for Trump, he doesn't know the comedian, and he didn't hear the comedian. He doesn't know anything about it, of course. So he's trying to ignore that it happened, and move on with his campaign, which, as I say, the actual policy or the actual messages in his closing argument, which, by the way, was Kamala Harris broke it, Trump will fix it. They were pretty powerful, but of course, as so often with Trump, rather overshadowed by controversy.
Interesting that Donald Trump has been making a particular pitch to Latino voters who in the past have perhaps tended to vote Democrat. And it does seem as though Trump has been making some inroads into that, picking up some support in those Latino communities.
Yeah, that's what we're seeing in the polls. And that's why Harris hasn't had a big breakaway in the southern states, the southern swing states, like particularly Nevada or Arizona, which have large Hispanic populations, like a quarter of the population of those states pretty much. And it's because more and more those voters are prepared to give Trump a look. They like what he says about the economy and inflation. He came up with, especially for Nevada, he came up with his no tax on tips policy. There's a lot of employees there in the casinos and restaurants who live off tips. And that was seen as an attractive policy, so much so that the Harris campaign pretty quickly followed it with its own pledge of no tax on tips a couple of weeks later. But it's really a trend that the election watchers have noticed, that Trump's very scathing remarks about illegal migrants causing crime, and his plans for a massive roundup and deportation of people in the country illegally, a lot of whom will be Hispanic from Central and South America. They're not causing him trouble with the settled Latino community. Quite the reverse. There are plenty of voters there who say, yes, we came through the legal migration routes, and we don't think people should be living in the country illegally. And they like Trump's message.
Yeah, I'm just looking at a report about Puerto Ricans for Trump making their way to that rally tonight, absolutely dismissive of those jokes made by some of the warm-up acts, and saying that they believe that a second Trump administration would benefit Latinos. I mean, that's not the only group of voters where Trump seems to be unexpectedly, perhaps, picking up support this time around.
Yeah, this is another reason why it looks like Trump is ahead in Georgia. Georgia has the third highest black population of any state in America. And the black vote was very important for Joe Biden winning there by a very, very narrow margin, 0.23% of the vote, like 11,780 votes famously out of 5 million. And it's because younger black men in particular are much more likely to give Trump a look now. It comes down to an appeal for them being overlooked by the Democrats. He's campaigned hard on the Democrats have not done anything for you. They've not made your economic circumstances better. In fact, they've made it worse. And also Trump's indefatigable, aggressive form of campaigning is really cutting through. It's seen as more attractive than the Harris style.
Kamala Harris's speech, we're told that she's going to be focusing on how her rival Donald Trump, wants to increase divisions in society, and talking about the way that he has sought to try to defy the law. Tell us a bit more about her approach and how that is working.
Well, Harris, the whole point, to come back to where we started, the whole point about Harris starting this final week of campaigning on the ellipse, where American democracy was thrown into doubt that day on January the 6th. The members of Congress were running for their lives when Trump supporters were breaking into Congress and marauding through the halls of the US Capitol. And that's in some way seems to have been fading from the memory, especially given under the Harris and Biden administration, of course, the inflation, which has been like an aggregate, I think, a cumulative inflation of well over 20% in all of these swing states, is a much more immediate concern to voters. So Harris is trying to remind them just what happened under Trump, just what may have been forgotten or perhaps deprioritized as people struggle to get by.
We're just a week out now from Election Day, although, of course, some early voting has already started. And the polls are really very tight indeed. I'm just looking at the Times' latest poll of polls in the projected overall share, gives Kamala Harris a couple of points lead. But that when you break it down to this electoral votes, because of course each state delivers a certain number of electoral votes, doesn't it? That actually Trump could emerge the winner.
Yeah, it's worth reminding, of course, that the president is not elected by a simple majority of Americans. The state by state, there are state by state contests, and each state has a certain weight in the electoral college that actually does vote on the president. So the bigger states carry more weight. And the way that the maths works out means that there are 5, 6, or 7 states that are really in play. All the other 43 states will vote predictably for either Harris or Trump, we think. But within those 7 states, there are various combinations available to the candidates that could produce one winner or the other. So if Harris holds the 3 Rust Belt states in the North, which Joe Biden flipped in 2020, so that's Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, she will hold the White House. It doesn't matter what happens in the other 4 swing states. If Trump flips back one or more of those, it becomes a lot more difficult for Harris to win, probably impossible, actually, especially without the biggest one of them that carries 19 votes in the Electoral College, and that's Pennsylvania.
And we're hearing that if the result is as tight as the polls suggest, that it could take, I mean, not just hours after the polls close, but even days to work out who's actually won.
That's all down to exactly how close it is, because most of those states have taken measures to speed up their vote counting. It took 3.5 days in 2020. We didn't know till Saturday morning that Joe Biden was the president. In fact, that was when Pennsylvania announced it, or when Pennsylvania became clear, I should say. Another quirk of the system is that it's the news media that calls the states when the tallies of votes that are continually being updated as more and more are confirmed, when they become obvious that a candidate has won, the media, the Associated Press actually is seen as the gold standard that calls the state. And we don't know the final tallies for a couple of weeks after that, as every single last vote is verified. But this time, all the early voting, and there's been a lot in person as well as postal voting, is being processed so that it can be counted very quickly on election day in most of the swing states. So we'll know in most of them on the night pretty much how they're going. However, Pennsylvania has not been able to speed up its system significantly and is expected to take a few days. So if it does all come down to Pennsylvania, we will be waiting again in this agonizing way to see who's won.
It is going to be fascinating. Plenty of special coverage here on Times Radio, of course, next week. Just finally, David, we've got 1 week of this campaign still to go. Obviously, lots of rallies and presumably then a big focus from both of the candidates on those swing states that you've been talking about.
Yeah, this is an unusual move by Harris to have a big rally in Washington, because the District of Columbia votes, there's only 3 of them in the Electoral College. They're not in doubt at all. It's definitely going to vote for her. But the whole point of this is to get media coverage, and it'll be interesting to see if some of the conservative networks follow the whole speech, as they did for Trump's press conference earlier today in Mar-a-Lago in Florida. Another state that, of course, is not really in doubt. We're pretty sure that Florida will vote for Trump. It was a swing state. Memories go back to 2000 and just how close it was between Bush and Gore. But now it's trended towards the Republicans. But I think this is the end of the big set pieces away from the swing states. We're going to see them crisscrossing those 7 states that are in play right up to the last minute.
David Charter.
Donald Trump, first of all, it was very Donald Trump, that address. He did turn to the border, he turned to the economy, and I think some of his people have been keen that he do that. A good swipe at Harris as well. Maybe what was missing was also interesting, what was not in his contribution today, because the news this week has been so dominated by that New York rally where we had those, well, plainly racist jokes aimed at Latino voters. An odd thing to hear at a rally of a party that wants Latino votes in the American election. And we're still waiting to see what sort of fallout may flow from that. Will it put many, many Latino voters off voting Republican who might otherwise have voted for Donald Trump? We have to wait and see where that's concerned. But there was speculation, wasn't there, Judy, that would Donald Trump do anything to row back on those remarks, the way that his campaign has tried to disown those remarks? And of course he didn't, because Donald Trump, Judy, does not do contrition, does he?
He doesn't. At least he didn't today. He has just distanced himself from that comedian, from that speaker, saying he didn't know them, he didn't hear the remarks, but he didn't even go as far as his own campaign did, when his campaign said that these remarks do not reflect the views of President Trump and the Trump campaign, despite the fact you have not only had Democrats, but a number of pro-Trump Republican allies and in and out of the Hispanic and Latino community here in the U.S. who have called on the former president to disavow those remarks and essentially apologize for having that speaker there in the first place. In Florida, for example, my home state, my hometown, Orlando, Florida, is home to a very large Puerto Rican population, and you have a number of Florida Republicans and Democrats really, voicing concern over these remarks. Senator Rick Scott, for example, the former governor of Florida, someone who has a lot of ties to Puerto Rico and the Puerto Rican community. You will remember during the Trump administration, there was Hurricane Maria, and a number of Puerto Ricans were displaced and eventually resettled in Florida. Rick Scott, a Republican, pro-Trump Republican, condemning those remarks. You have Congressman Carlos Jimenez from the Miami area. He is also condemning those remarks. But, you also have the political part of this and how this could impact the election. Remember, this election is all about the margins. It's all about winning over these slivers of the electorate. Even if you don't win the majority of a certain group, if you get a certain number of voters from a certain voting bloc, that could end up making a major difference. And if you look at Pennsylvania itself, more specifically, Philadelphia, you have a pretty significant number of Puerto Rican voters. And we know that in general, Puerto Ricans have tended to lean more to the left or voted more liberally in the past, but Donald Trump was looking to make inroads with them, like he has with the rest of the Hispanic and Latino community and voting blocs within that community. So this, on the onset at least, would do nothing to win over those voters. And on top of that, you have a lot of these undecided swing independent voters who may or may not be Hispanic or Latino, who are looking at the Trump campaign and may say, hey, I liked the economy under Donald Trump. I like his policies on immigration or his policies on this or that, but I don't like the chaos. I don't like the distractions. I don't like the circus. And this right here is a major distraction.
Yeah.
Instead of being able to talk about the economy and policies, Donald Trump is being forced to talk about this, and he's digging in.
Yeah, I mean, I want to bring in Rachel and Tim in a second, but listening to Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago a little bit earlier on, there was a lot of bemoaning the absence of Joe Biden, said he'd been removed by a coup. Again, what's the point of that? I mean, who is he trying to appeal to with that? Or is it Donald Trump wishing that he was running against Joe Biden, which he now is not?
I think it's maybe a little bit of both. I think, you've heard this narrative from Republicans for a few months now, going back to when Harris became the presumptive Democratic nominee back in July, essentially saying she was made that nominee undemocratically, saying she was put there. There wasn't really a real primary. The problem with that argument, though, is that she didn't have any challengers. I mean, the progressive wing of the party had ample enough opportunity to put forth their own challenger and to, push back on Harris. And we have seen some of that pushback on a number of issues, like, for example, the war in the Middle East, the war in Gaza, with Vice President Harris's role in the Biden administration. But, that argument isn't really sticking. And it's also ironic because we know that Donald Trump and so many Republicans were, they wanted to run against Joe Biden because he was perceived as a weaker candidate. But they felt that, they were saying it's a risk to have someone that old or, in their words, mentally incompetent at the top of the ticket or in the presidency.
I do want to sort of explore some of your instincts and maybe a bit of your educated guesswork in a moment about where we are with this race, which could not be any closer. Rachel's here, Tim's here. Rachel.
It's just really interesting, like the run up to it. Obviously, these comments by this comedian are a major story, particularly because of the voter demographic that they were targeted at. And I take the point about Puerto Ricans being a significant voting bloc in Florida or in Pennsylvania. But just having been following this for the last year, is there really anything between now and Tuesday that you think that anyone thinks could change it? I mean, voters seem to, the number of voters who seem undecided, to genuinely don't know which side they're going to vote for, must be vanishingly small. I know the polls are difficult to read. I know it's very difficult because they're different demographics, different states. It's a sort of pollster's nightmare. But do we really think that anything between now and next Tuesday could move the dial?
Julie?
I think It's a very, very small number of voters, first of all. I mean, I'm going to reference a poll from a week ago, a national poll that, sort of in their sample size had about 6% undecided voters. That number could be larger, it could be a little smaller, but I would guess it's around that ballpark generally. And there's also the question of, are these voters who are saying they are undecided, do they lean one way or lean the other? It seems to be conventional wisdom that most of this is baked in for voters now. But I think there are still undecided voters. Not only undecided in terms of, am I going to vote for Kamala Harris or am I going to vote for Donald Trump, but also voters who may lean towards, let's say, Kamala Harris, but they may say, I don't know if I'm going to go out and vote. I don't know if I'm, going to put in that effort, even to vote earlier, to go to my polling precinct on election day. And remember, the decision not to vote is sort of a major decision in itself. It plays into the final count. So I think that plays into this as well.
Tim.
Excuse me, we say the election is nearly over, and of course in one way it will be next Tuesday, but there's lots of speculation about how both sides will react to defeat. And I wonder whether you can tell us anything at all about what preparations are being made by law enforcement and perhaps the grandees of America, if there are such people who can reach across the aisle, to calm what, from the side of the Atlantic, seems a very unhappy, divided nation. And whoever wins, it's going to be on a small margin.
Yeah.
And politics just seems to have become far too important in America. Elections matter much more than they ever used to, and that's not healthy. And what is the scale of preparation, if you know, to the outcome?
It's large scale preparations. I mean, I'm talking to you and I am just roughly, a few blocks from the Capitol building. If you walk out of my office right now, the Capitol building is right there.
Yeah.
So, and I remember 4 years
Better
ago.
protected than 4 years ago, yeah.
Exactly, right. And I remember 4 years ago in the aftermath of January 6th, I mean, that entire complex was completely fenced off. And I think law enforcement certainly is more prepared this time. I think, for example, Washington, D.C. itself, I'm a resident of Washington, D.C., so this is something I'm personally concerned with, is also, from what I understand, there are preparations underway. But there's also, there's concerning, signs out there. Like you hear, for example, of the in the Pacific Northwest, there have been stories or accounts of ballot boxes that have been lit on fire in the past couple of days. So there's certainly a lot of concerning signs. And we know that, the FBI has been working to, sort of prevent any possible plots. It seems that, we hear a lot about outside election interference, but there really does seem to be a concern this time around, considering what happened 4 years ago, about anything happening from within, really, among Americans, any domestic extremism, that kind of a thing. So I think law enforcement is certainly more prepared this time, but it's hard to figure out what we should be prepared for. I mean, the environment already is so different from what it was 4 years ago already. So I think there is a preparation, but still a lot of uncertainty. And it's not just preparations being made here in Washington, D.C. I would imagine in states across the country, this will be, of concern as well.
Julie, always a pleasure. Let's talk again soon. I
Thank
hope
you.
I'm going to be right there in Philadelphia in a very few days' time. Thought in from Jonathan in Dulwich. Seems to think I'm maybe being a bit tough on Donald Trump. He says, would you ever say it's Harris being Harris in the way that you say it's Trump being Trump? Probably the answer to that is maybe I wouldn't. Because, can anyone think of a candidate in a race like this whose character is so synonymous with who he is, his politics, his plans for the presidency, and what the presidency would become were this man to be the president? I can't think of any parallel to remotely compare with him in that way. Donald Trump is in that way somewhat unique in modern history, unless, Tim, you want to disagree.
Well, it's completely unique, but I tell you just a little thing that is never really covered by British media is, and I heard it all of the time when I was in America in 2016 covering the Trump-Clinton election for the Times. people talked incessantly about how politicians arrived in Washington not very wealthy and all left wealthy. It's a huge issue for the average Americans. They think their whole system is corrupt. Look at Biden, look at Pelosi. They have enriched themselves through politics. K Street, the lobbying arm in Washington, is huge. The number of lobbyists per senator is like 12 to 1, I think, just for pharmaceuticals or something. The American people think their politicians are absolutely corrupt. And so they take that as read. And so one of the reasons they like Trump is he's already rich. He can't be corrupt.
I mean, he's not as rich as he says he is.
Oh, he's definitely not as rich as he says he is. But I wonder sometimes, John, whether we look at enough at why people who know Trump is racist, they don't like it and they're still willing to vote for him.
Oh,
because
sure.
it's always a vote of lesser two evils.
Oh, for sure. That's part of the mission. That's part of what we do. And certainly part of my mission in these coming weeks is to talk about not just how people are going to vote, which is what we do at elections time, but also why they're going to vote. But just on the point that you made there, I mean, I wouldn't make that distinction too firmly, because, I mean, you could put a stack of evidence together that thick on examples of Donald Trump being said to have enriched himself personally through the presidency, channeling federal money into his own businesses and pocket in a way that I can't think of too many parallels that go precisely alongside that. However, your point about the motivation of the American voter is absolutely fascinating and very much bears exploring, and that's part of what we're going to be keen to do.
Pennsylvania has 580,000 people of Puerto Rican descent. And now, in a state which could be decided by tens of thousands, even thousands of votes, that's a significant block. We can't say that all Puerto Ricans vote the same way. We can't say that they all have the same priority issue. We can't even say that they'll react the same way to those offensive, vulgar remarks by a podcaster calling Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. We can't even say how they'll react to the memory that Donald Trump held up $20 billion of federal assistance to Puerto Rico as it was reeling from that damage. But I think it's safe to say that a lot of Puerto Ricans will be disconcerted that the Trump rally could feature such a hateful, despicable remark. And I think when we say it's not just Puerto Ricans, I think there will be a lot of people who are not Puerto Ricans who will be at the least discomfited by those remarks. And I think we have to go even broader than that. I mean, while I understand why you're focusing on that comment, because it's gotten the headlines, let's recall that this rally was filled with vitriol and hate, that there were vile sexual slurs about Hispanic and Latino voters, even as Trump is supposedly courting their votes, slurs that I can't repeat on air. There were insults of black voters, even as Trump is supposedly courting them. Trump is supposedly courting the Arab American vote in the context of Gaza, yet Rudy Giuliani, his former lawyer, said Palestinians are taught to kill Americans from the age of 2. Kamala Harris was called prostitute, the devil, the Antichrist. Hillary Clinton was derided with this, a vulgar insult that I can't repeat here. And far from distancing himself from those comments, Trump actually embraced that division. He embraced that confrontation, and he threatened again to use the military against enemies within, which is his phrase for any Americans who expressed opposition to his views and his actions, not just extremists and radicals. So what I'm putting out there is that I think it is another variable in a toss-up election, but to try to say it's the decisive variable, well, the problem here is that you have a very damaged American political culture, and whether issues and Trump's threat overtake the spectacle, the circus that has propelled him this far, I can't make that judgment call yet. I do think that the timing of this is very important, because since the single debate between Trump and Harris, I think around the 10th of September, we have not had a catalytic event that defines this election. Trump refused to do any other debates. So the Trump campaign could kind of hope that it would just steal the news cycle, sometimes with outrageous remarks, and that it wouldn't be held to account. And that would be the way that they would build up this momentum to try to defeat Harris. Now, I think last weekend, the combination of two very different images were significant. I think you had Trump's rally on the Sunday, but just before that, you had Michelle Obama's appearance with Kamala Harris in Michigan. And you had Michelle Obama, although she was speaking primarily about women's rights, especially reproductive rights, asking what side of history do you want to be on? And saying that the stakes were too great to sit this one out, and that, let's not, beat around the bush, that lives are at stake, including women's lives are at stake here. Now, if people are starting to pay attention, you've got that message. And then you got Kamala Harris just hours before the Trump rally saying, this is an election with two competing visions of America. One vision which she puts forward of being the way forward, of being cooperation rather than confrontation, of being dialogue rather than division. And then you get, the Trump hate fest that follows this. And it did change the media narrative. For weeks, a lot of, the so-called mainstream American media had been both sides in this. Well, on the one hand, Trump does this, but on the other hand, Harris does this. Or they had been trying to normalize Trump, right? At one point calling some of his bizarre antics political improvisation. So the New York Times comes out and says, look, this is a rally which was racist. This was misogynist. This was hate-filled. You get other outlets talking about the crude language that was used. And I would say, if we left it at that, in a toss-up election, perhaps that is the key shift that takes place. But here, as I speak to you on a Wednesday, the Trump outlets, who of course ignored all of this on Sunday, they ignored all that hatred. They talked about Fox talked about an exhilarating rally filled with Americans who took pride in their country, never even paid attention to the remarks. Here they are on the Wednesday, and the Trump outlets are saying, oh, the real story is that Joe Biden, who I think, made a statement that was not politically smart, implied that Trump supporters are garbage rather than Puerto Rico. And so they could try to change that news cycle. Now, will that be successful? I can't tell you, because something else could happen in the next 6 days. I think what I would say is this. What the events of the last 72 hours have done is they've increased the chance of even higher turnout. In 2020, remember, well, actually, let me walk this back. In 2016, remember, the Democrats did not lose because Trump surged. They lost because people sat on their hands and did not vote, especially in the state of Michigan. In 2020, the Democrats won because it was one of the highest turnouts in recent U.S. history. I think it was close to 70%, and that favors them. If these events increase and boost turnout, I think that favors the Democrats, which is why, with all the news outlets chasing their tails over the polls and, just simply turning this into a horse race and avoiding discussion of issues, I wouldn't do that. I would not say the polls indicate anything definitive about this race, but just simply point to the importance of, if the Democrats turn out their people, they probably win. If the Trumpists turn out their people, or the Democrats don't, then Trump may get back into the White House. I think what has happened in the last 72 hours is going to raise the turnout. I think you already have evidence from the early voting that we are going to get a high turnout. Georgia, North Carolina were recording record turnouts. I think the early returns from Pennsylvania are pointing to a high turnout there. But I think the elevation, finally, of the issues, and I think women's rights through Michelle Obama's speech is a good example. I think that could boost turnout. I think that Trump unwittingly highlighting his threat to America. I mean, America is an idea as well to the U.S. system. I think that might boost turnout. I think the Trump people know that. And I think the problem they have here is that they can't depress turnout. They can't then say, well, everybody don't go vote. I think what they have to do is then double down on getting their folks out to the polls as well. And that's never a bad thing. It's never a bad thing when you talk about get out the vote. And I think I'll add one thing I saw today because I'm not a big fan of the U.S. media narrative, how they play this election. While recognizing that Jennifer O'Malley Dillon is the Harris campaign manager, while recognizing that she'll spin when she puts out a message, she put out a lengthy message on social media that said, look, this is an important election. It's going to be close, but we're not anxious. We're not anxious here. So all that talk of the Democrats panicking or being jittery, and I genuinely thought that despite the fact that Dillon might be spinning, I saw something there which is like they actually think the early turnout, the early voting returns actually are pointing that they are in better shape than what the media is saying. It's still close, still very, very tight election, but I think they're counting on the fact they've got a better ground game than the Trump people, and that ground game will turn out more folks next Tuesday than maybe the media are expecting at this point. I can't imagine that the Trump folks are very happy the way that Madison Square Garden rally turned out. And of course, they did distance themselves from that one remark by Tony Hinchcliffe, the podcaster, about Puerto Rico as an island of garbage. Didn't distance themselves from any of the other remarks, it should be noted. But they did show a little bit of concern that they weren't getting the great press they expected because they wanted attention to this. That's why it was in Madison Square Garden. But their reaction, of course, is just attack, 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 and hope that they grab the news cycle back. So while they were discomfited, I do think they know that they've got certain outlets that are effectively their mouthpieces. Fox is the best known. And that they simply were going to double down on Fox with the attack lines that no, it's the Democrats who are the threat. It's Kamala Harris who is the menace here. Here, well, good Americans support us. And I do think that Joe Biden's gaffe, where he made that specific remark, just as Hillary Clinton shouldn't have called Trump supporters deplorables in 2016, Biden shouldn't have indicated they were garbage. And even though you walk that back, I think the Trump folks say, all right, this is where we can attack, which is why you have almost every element of right-wing media is just going wall to wall with this and ignoring any other issue. And we'll try to hold that for at least the next 24, 48 hours because it sucks the oxygen out of the room. We don't want to be talking about women's rights. We don't want to be talking about the threat to democracy. In a way, we don't even want to be talking about the economy because they're not sure that Trump as a candidate can hold it together on the economy. So, the best way of portraying this is, look at what the Democrats have done. They're the enemies within, to use Trump's own phrase. Well, Kamala Harris will be in swing states throughout this week. She is today. But the reason why the Harris campaign framed the Tuesday event at the White House ellipse as putting that closing argument was symbolic. It's symbolic that this is where less than 4 years ago, Donald Trump called on his supporters to prevent the orderly transfer of power to Joe Biden. This was the culmination of months of attempts to overturn the 2020 election. So they were representing how far this man went. It was a coup attempt, if you want to be blatant about it, even though Harris didn't use exactly those words. So you have that symbolic location. You have that event, which is a marker of what Trump is like. And then you make the closing argument. That threat is still there. That threat is still there to the system. Is this the man you want? And Harris juxtaposing freedom versus division. Is that what you really want? And I think it worked. I think, again, the Trump folks will try to sweep it away with Biden's remark about garbage, and that's all right. But I think it sticks. I think Harris's message sticks. We just don't know with how many people it sticks. We don't know how many people make that their priority issue, which is the overriding threat. But I have to say that Trump gave them that opening with the Madison Square Garden rally. And even as he makes his own appearances in the next few days, there will be increased scrutiny of him because the American media, it runs as a pack, right? And they've gone through the phase from late July when Harris entered the race to the start of September, she's surging, she's surging, she's surging. Then after the debate until now, they've run as a pack and said, oh, she's plateaued, she's plateaued, she's plateaued. What we now have is these last few frenetic days. And there will be these appearances in the swing states where any remark by Harris or Trump could be seized upon about the pack is, could this be the unexpected decider that takes place? And which means, again, anybody that predicts this election is a fool. Sorry, they're absolute fool, because both what might occur in the next 6 days and the media's framing of it, that's beyond the predictable at this point.
Robert Nix and John Conway, thank you both very much for joining us tonight. Let me ask you, first of all, Robert, you're a former Trump voter. At what stage, or what was the moment that you decided that you could no longer support him?
Well, I never was a big supporter. I was a Republican all my life since 1980. I registered to vote for Ronald Reagan in 1980 and voted for a Republican every year since then. So in 2016, I thought, well, the choice is between Clinton and Trump. I wasn't a supporter of Trump, but I couldn't believe he got the nomination. I was flabbergasted, but I thought, well, I'm a Republican and give him a chance. And what could go wrong? He's got adults in the room. He's got guardrails. There's all these guardrails and adults. And I thought, what could go wrong? And I quickly realized early in 2017 that there was going to be a problem. He seemed to be undermining the Constitution, seemed to be actively wanting to avoid all accountability on which our entire Constitution is based, checks and balances, the rule of law, denigrating the press, the free press, so all of that sent warning signs right away. So by the time 2020 came along, I knew I couldn't vote for him a second time.
And John, what prompted you to form this group, Republicans Against Trump? I mean, he's your party's nominee. He got that nomination by pretty fair and square means.
Yeah, we started Republican Voters Against Trump ahead of the 2020 presidential election in order to try and defeat him in that election. We were very successful with Joe Biden's victory in 2020, and we decided in 2024 we once again had to launch this campaign because we know folks like Robert, a former Trump voter who's identified as Republican all their life, is the most persuasive messenger to make the case against a second Trump presidency, because Robert can speak directly to the same voters who are on the fence in states like Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin. He can say, look, I voted for the guy in the past, like you have been a Republican all my life, but I have to support Kamala Harris because Donald Trump is categorically unfit to be in office again. So we know messengers like Robert are the most persuasive with the key swing voters that are ultimately going to decide this election. And, you know, we've been incredibly successful at finding hundreds of folks, not only Robert, but across the country, in all 50 states. We've found volunteers to tell their stories, to speak up, even though they're Republicans.
Robert, are you not, as somebody who describes yourself as a lifelong Republican supporter and voter, are you not concerned at some of Kamala Harris's policies, her platform, her program for government?
Well, I do, but I think we're beyond worrying about individual issues. I paraphrase Liz Cheney when she said we can get by with bad policy, we can survive it, but we can't survive the trampling of our Constitution and the undermining of our form of government. I think that sort of transcends any issues like abortion or Israel or inflation or things like that. We can get by. We can, even if I don't agree with her, even if I had to hold my nose like I did in 2020 to vote for Biden, and we're still, it is a much bigger danger that we're facing than any issue that I may or may not agree with in a Harris administration.
Throughout this campaign, Donald Trump has faced a series of court cases, a series of controversies that could well have stopped any other candidate, but he seems to simply rise above them. We've had a huge fuss about the Madison Square Gardens rally, where some of the warm-up acts told supposed jokes that were blatantly racist. But Donald Trump has said, well, I don't know anything about that. And it doesn't seem to have damaged his standing, even with Latino voters?
Well, I'm here in Pennsylvania, and there's a huge Puerto Rican population here. I was involved with Hispanic outreach for the Republican Party 20 years ago. I worked with Bush Cheney on Hispanic outreach, and with Senator Santorum and Arlen Specter, and I worked with the Republican State Committee. The party has changed so much since then that here I am now, and I'm not the one that changed, and I'm one of the faces of Republican voters against Trump. But I would say that I am sensing a lot of anger. Well, maybe not of people that have already decided, but there's plenty of Latino vote in Pennsylvania that would never have voted, wouldn't have voted in this election at all, and now they're angered, so that maybe people who weren't planning to vote are now going to vote against Trump because of anger of that. So that might be something. And in a state like Pennsylvania, where it's this close, and that difference of tens of thousands could make a big difference.
So just to be clear, John Conway, you're saying that those remarks about Puerto Ricans, you think that could have an effect on some of those key voters in one of the key swing states?
Yeah, I think Robert's analysis is exactly right. In a state like Pennsylvania, we know it's going to be decided by tens of thousands of votes. And the closing message from the Trump campaign is reminding voters what they dislike about Trump, which is that Trump is hateful. Trump brings people into the party who want to cause division, who don't respect all Americans. And so the comments at Madison Square Garden are a reminder of all the reasons why voters like Robert rejected Donald Trump in 2020, why voters in 2024 who are still undecided because they can't get there on Donald Trump. After 8 years of watching Donald Trump, they aren't sold yet. And they aren't sold because of exactly what they saw at Trump's rally, his divisiveness, the type of politics that he's fostered in this country. And so for Trump's closing message to be headlined by these racist remarks, by these bigoted remarks, it could make a difference for those few thousand voters on the fence, not only in the Puerto Rican community, which makes up half of the Latino population in Pennsylvania, but for other voters who are on the fence who are really questioning, do I want to live through another 4 years of Donald Trump's administration? And the answer, I think, is going to be no.
But those remarks from Joe Biden today, which were taken by many to be him suggesting that supporters of Donald Trump were garbage, although Biden has been insisting that he was talking about the particular comedian at that Madison Square Gardens rally. Aren't you worried that Joe Biden's comments there have meant that it's the Democrats who are likely to be damaged by this episode?
No, I don't think so. I think Joe Biden made the honorable decision to not run for the nomination this year. And I think voters have Kamala Harris and Donald Trump at the top of their heads right now. And the comments made by Joe Biden, which I do believe were taken out of context. I do believe he was referring directly to the comments that comedian Tony Hinchcliffe made. Regardless, voters are going to go into the voting booth on Tuesday, and they're going to make a choice between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, not Joe Biden.
The race looks very close indeed, although Kamala Harris has a slight lead in the overall vote share. It doesn't look as though she's got a comfortable enough lead in those key swing states to be anything like confident of victory. Robert, are you concerned about what could happen if there is a very tight result? If, for example, it's so close that Republicans, that Donald Trump refuses to accept the result?
Oh, absolutely. We saw already the trial run for this after 2020. Not only did he perpetrate the big lie that has absolutely undermined confidence in our entire electoral system, but then he instigated an insurrection, which is also undermined confidence in one of the key points of our entire government, which is the peaceful transfer of power. And all of that was just the beginning. That was their amateur attempt. I think they've had 4 years to sort of plan that they're going to do anything possible post November 5th to try to make this come their way, and they've had Steve Bannon was the architect of all this type of getting people at the local levels, at the state levels, all these Trump supporters into positions in secretaries of states and key election officials, and now they're going to try to use that here afterward. I don't think it's anywhere near over November 5th. I'm really worried for our country. I'm really worried what comes next. I don't think anybody can celebrate anything on November 5th, and that we're going to be fighting this ugly far right ultra nationalist movement, which isn't even really a Republican Party anymore, for the balance of the 2020s. I'm really concerned about that.
John Conway, do you think, despite all that you and Robert have told us tonight, and of course we do talk to pro-Trump Republicans as well, that Donald Trump is heading for another term in the White House?
No, I don't. I think there are millions of Republicans across the country, folks like Robert, folks beyond Robert who voted for Donald Trump in 2020, who saw the consequences of his election lies, who are going to vote for Kamala Harris because they're going to put country over party this year. I think Donald Trump has proven every single day that he's been the Republican nominee, and when he's been Republican president, and when he's been running this year, that he's categorically unfit for office. This is somebody who committed an insurrection against our government. This is a 34-time convicted felon who is also found liable of sexual abuse. And I think when voters go to the polls on Tuesday, they're going to look at their ballot and they're going to see Kamala Harris and they're going to see Donald Trump. And when they look at Donald Trump, they're going to be reminded of all of these reasons why he's off-putting, all of the reasons why he's unfit for office. And they might look at Kamala Harris, like Robert said, and say, I don't agree 100% with everything she stands for, but I know she's going to protect our Constitution. They know that she's going to protect our country, and they're going to know that Kamala Harris truly believes in the American experiment, and Donald Trump doesn't. And I think ultimately those late-breaking undecideds who walk into the voting booth, still not sure who they're going to vote for, are going to circle in Kamala Harris's name this November.
John Conway and Robert Nix, thank you both very much.
While we're in the home straight, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have set out their final stalls. They're swishing through the battleground states in the last rush before voting day. The last week has been a bit of a series of gaffes from both sides. There was the famous, now in the wrong way, comedian who insulted Puerto Rico at a New York rally yesterday. Joe Biden was in it, rather, for jumping onto all of this. Seemed to call Trump voters garbage. Have a listen.
Donald Trump has no character. He doesn't give a damn about the Latino community. And just the other day, a speaker at his rally called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. Well, let me tell you something. I don't know the Puerto Rican that I know, or Puerto Rico where I'm in my home state of Delaware. They're good, decent, honorable people. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. His demonization of Latinos is unconscionable.
Well, that didn't come out maybe quite as well as it might have done. I mean, Joe Biden and his team insist he was calling what it was that this comedian had to say about Puerto Rico and the Latinos. He was saying that was garbage, not Trump supporters. But Donald Trump himself, as you'd expect, he jumped on this thing. He climbed into a bin lorry covered in Trump campaign banners. He talked to journalists, seemed to take those comments, or made a show of taking these comments very seriously.
I think the Democrats have done a very poor job. We're leading in every state. We're leading big, and I think that the comment made by really both of them, because there are really two of them, about being garbage, maybe 250 million people, they shouldn't be talking. That's like deplorable for Hillary. This is the deplorable for Hillary, and I think this is worse, actually. For Joe Biden to make that statement, it's really a disgrace.
Well, let's first of all then touch in with David Charter, Times US Assistant Editor in the United States. Hello to you, David.
Hello, John from Washington, D.C.
Welcome to the show, David, as always. So, Garbage Gate, I don't know if anyone's calling it that now, but I just did. And the way that it's played out, what do you make of it? It's a study, David, in election gaffes and election gimmicks, isn't it, all at once?
Yeah, and Trump, the great showman, he leapt upon it immediately. Not only did he show up with a garbage truck in Wisconsin, but he had a rally last night there, and he wore the fluorescent vest that is worn by the garbage collectors throughout the rally and made great play of it, saying that his staff talked him into it because they told him it made it look thinner. So that's how they convinced him to wear it. And it was really Trump in his element. He'd got something to campaign on, to fight back against, and completely overwhelm any coverage that Kamala Harris might have earned from her big supposed closing speech in Washington, D.C. on the Tuesday night. Well, it's all really been overshadowed by this row about garbage. And I have to say, it's that sort of classic sub-editor's dream headline, an apostrophe catastrophe, because that's how the White House tried to spin it. They said that the garbage belongs to the supporters. So there's an apostrophe on it. It was belonging to the supporters rather than describing the supporters without an apostrophe. Yeah. Well, that is pretty lame. It hasn't worked. Even if it was the intention, it hasn't worked. And I'm sure the Harris campaign's tearing his hair out about it, to be honest.
I mean, inevitably, David, people like us are going to focus with laser-like intensity on just about everything that happens in these crucial final days. I guess the question that really you want to address is it going to move the dial? Any of this, either way, from what we've seen? This story's been running for days.
Well, we don't know because very little has significantly moved the dial, although now, of course, Americans are really paying attention. It's quite easy and quite likely that a lot of Americans have ignored much of the build-up to the election and a lot of the stuff that we've been analysing up until the final week. But early voting is open. The final deadlines for postal votings are closing soon, and people are going to go to the polls on Tuesday. So it's everywhere now. And if you live in a swing state, it's totally unavoidable. The advertising that you're being bombarded with. So on the Republican side, in those swing states, especially Hispanic voters are being targeted with these garbage ads by the Trump side. The Harris campaign has just cut an advert in Spanish to launch at the Hispanic swing voters with the original comments at this was back at the Trump rally on Saturday in Madison Square Gardens, where the comedian was critical. We'd got a joke out of Puerto Rico because a lot of Puerto Ricans have settled and are voters in the swing states.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big Latino population in Pennsylvania, which, as I was saying, is absolutely one of the crucial battlegrounds, the crucial battleground, David. I mean, whoever it is that wins Pennsylvania, it is suggested that could be the thing. That could be the thing that tips it.
I agree with that, John. I definitely agree, because what Harris has to do to win is to hold those three Rust Belt states that are swing states. So that's Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. If she holds those three and every other state that that Biden won, she can afford to lose Georgia and Arizona in the Sun Belt down south. And because Pennsylvania is the biggest one with 19 votes in the Electoral College that actually decides the election, we've got to keep reminding, of course, that it's not a straight majority vote for the president. It's based on the states and how big they are and how much weight they carry in the Electoral College. So if she wins, if she holds Pennsylvania, that's more votes, 19, than say North Carolina, which is 16. Georgia is 16. So some of these states she can afford to miss with the way the maths works out if she holds those three northern states. And because Pennsylvania is A, the biggest, and B, will probably take the longest to count because they haven't speeded up their processes that much this time, well, I think we're going to be hanging on for that state to see who's won the election. And I have to tell you, the Trump people on the ground are really confident. They think they've got Pennsylvania. Really? And look, in as far as it's possible, David, are you persuaded by the arguments? Whenever you look at what's written and reported, the columns and the Substack pieces, you get on both sides, among the Democrats and among the Republicans, what looks like a conviction that the polls may be very, very even, but the subtext, the undercurrents are working their way. Is it your judgment that the Republicans
genuinely believe that they are the ones who are pulling ahead, and that may be the case. Do you have your own view on that, or is it simply not possible to call it?
It's actually not possible to call it, John, at the moment. We're seeing every single poll coming out being very close. We've just got a Washington Post poll on Michigan. And this is interesting. They found that the registered voters split for Trump 47 to 45. But the likely voters, in other words, the smaller group who say they're very certain to vote, they split for Harris 47-46.
Right.
What does that tell you? It's a turnout game.
Yeah.
This country is split down the middle. If 100% of people voted in this country, it would be 50-50.
Yes.
It's all about who gets them to the polls to cast their ballot.
Yeah, goodness me, David. I'm looking forward to resuming the conversation when I'm there in the USA next week. David Charter there, US Assistant Editor of The Times. Now, let's get another perspective. Talk to David Lunow, the UK Bureau Chief of the Wall Street Journal. Welcome to you, David.
It's a pleasure to be here, John. Thanks for having me.
Hi. So you're covering obviously you're covering affairs here in England and in UK and in Europe, but you're also looking at the US election through a European and a UK lens. What does that involve? What are the stories you're feeding back to the Wall Street Journal from here with that in mind?
Well, the first story I did was on how insanely costly US elections are compared to the rest of the world. I got the idea when I was looking up after the UK election this summer how much money the different candidates raised. The Tories under Sunak raised about $2.7 million during the 6-week campaign. Labour got about $10 million. Well, Kamala Harris has raised $1.5 billion in the last 2 months. She raises in 5 hours what Sunak raised in 6 weeks. So that got me thinking, oh my, I'm not sure Americans realize just how out of whack our elections are compared to the rest of the world. I mean, the entire UK process took 6 weeks. The winner accepted the result, the loser conceded gracefully, and there was a transition of power the very next day. Here in America, I'm actually in New York right now, our elections take the better part of 2 years. The overall election is going to cost an estimated $15.9 billion. And by the end of this long and exhausting process, I think everyone's just tired of politics. Everyone's been worked up into a frenzy of hate for the other half of the country. And it does make you wonder if this is the best we can do for the world's longest running democracy.
I mean, those numbers, David, are simply mind-boggling. $16 billion. We've just had as you'll know, we just had the budget statement of the Chancellor yesterday in the House of Commons at Westminster, $16 billion. We're talking about the sum, which is not far off what's being devoted in the budget to education across this country. It makes the amounts of money we get in a British election look like chicken feed. It is so extraordinary. Now, meanwhile, there's obviously the perspective on the American election as it is from London, from Brussels, and from this side of the Atlantic. And you'll be reporting, I've no doubt, of the concern on this side of the Atlantic about those implications. It's going to mean so much for America's role as the central pillar of the Western Alliance, to say nothing of the world economy.
Yeah, I tell my friends in America that things look very different when you're sitting in Europe looking back across that vast ocean. Of course, the possibility of Trump winning is the one that really frightens a lot of Europeans. It's really the return of sort of this America first nationalism. It's long been a strain in U.S. politics. I mean, from George Washington, who famously warned about not getting involved in foreign entanglements, to the isolationism that kept the U.S. out of World War I for much of the action, and out of World War II until we were directly attacked by Japan. So, in a way, the last few decades of American internationalism, the American-led post-World War II order that we've all grown up with, was a bit of an anomaly. And, yes, America made terrible mistakes along the way. I mean, Vietnam and the Iraq War are two of many that spring to mind. But it also helped build the international order that has allowed the world to experience a relatively historic period of peace and prosperity. And while many may bemoan sort of America's leadership role, what does the world look like without it? It may be one of these things of be careful what you wish for. So we can imagine if Trump wins, that a world will have a less visible U.S. footprint. The U.S. becomes a more transactional foreign policy. In terms of Europe, this means, if Trump, he's long talked about how NATO countries don't pay their share in terms of defense spending. Obviously, the big question is whether or not he will pull through on his basically how much he's going to side with Russia in the Ukraine war. Does he stop funding Ukraine? What does that mean for Kyiv? What does that mean for Brussels? What does that mean for the rest of us living in Europe? Those are obviously very deep questions that no one really knows the answer to. It does feel like with an America that's more focused on itself and more navel gazing, it gives space in the world to other actors, particularly Russia and China. I think Trump is obviously much more geared up to challenge China, but less so Russia. So for Europe, that has quite a lot of implications. And then there's the whole economic policy. He's not only sort of returning to an era of the 19th century on foreign policy, but he's also returning to an era of 19th century mercantilist policy. He really sounds like a politician from the 1890s talking about a glorious time in America's past when the government was financed by tariffs on imports rather than income taxes. So, he's proposed obviously a broad 10% tariffs on all imports. Yes. That will hurt UK exports to the US. That will hurt European exports. Yes. How does the UK respond? How do Brussels respond? Do we do tit for tat tariffs? Do we go down that road? I think there's a lot of concern about how to address things. Obviously, if Harris wins, it's a much easier scenario. It's more business as usual. She may want to pressure Israel a bit more on Gaza, but you're going to see a lot of the same things that you saw under the Biden administration continue.
Right. I mean, it is also argued that if Kamala Harris wins, well, then the kind of, intimate engagement between America and this side of the Atlantic, well, that's over then. But of course, a Trump victory would bring potentially seismic implications. And curious to so many of us on this side, as you know, David, that these issues are lumped together as foreign affairs and matter so little to so many US voters.
They do. It's extraordinary how little, when you look at the polls of what worries American voters, there's a big disconnect between domestic and foreign policy. I mean, the number one issue is inflation. And, when I sit in Europe and I look at the American economy and you look at the chart of GDP growth, I've actually got the Wall Street Journal in front of me, and the U.S. economy again rose at 2.8% in the third quarter, posting more strong growth. I mean, those are growth rates we would kill for in Europe. And yet the Americans are very down on the economy. They feel like the direction of the country is headed in the wrong way. The economy hasn't been good. And I think in large part, this perception has been shaped by really inflation. Just things are more expensive than they were before the pandemic. So even though the economy is growing, people feel worse off, particularly the working class, where they can sort of protect themselves less from inflation. So there's sort of, inflation, immigration, the economy. A lot of these issues dominate the conversation, dominate the thinking, dominate the way people are voting. Much further down the line is whether or not anyone's really caring that much about how Ukraine's faring on the battleground against Russia.
It is just so fascinating. David Lunau, UK Bureau Chief of the Wall Street Journal there. Thank you for coming on the programme this afternoon.
Joining me this evening in the studio, Scarlett Maguire, Director of the pollsters JL Partners. Evening, Scarlett.
Good evening, Kate.
Lovely to see you again. Joanna Masker's with us, a former senior official for Barack Obama. Good evening, Joanna.
Great to be here.
Good to be with you, thank you. And Molly Ball, political correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, also with us tonight.
Hi.
Hi, Molly. Scarlett, I know that you have recently been in the United States. You work across both sides of the pond. You were there 10 days ago. You're due to go out again on Monday.
Yeah.
Just from a Brit perspective, what is so different about working on a US election? What is so different about the political climate over there?
Okay, so in terms of the political climate, I just say that to me, especially compared to our last election, it feels a lot more energetic. So I think things can feel energetic at UK elections. I don't think that's what happened to us this time around. We had very low turnout. It was quite a low energy campaign from both sides. And there was a sense of, obviously voters were very fed up, but there was just a general sense of sort of apathy, and that is not what I get when I'm in America. Yes, I think there are a lot of voters that aren't actually thrilled about either candidate, but both sides seem to be a lot more energetic and fight for it a lot harder. There's obviously also a lot more money in American politics, which means they're able to campaign in ways that we just don't see over here. Things like the sheer amount of political advertisements that they flood the zone with, all
Kamala
the physical
Harris,
campaign
Harris's
trails.
face on that ellipse.
Exactly, it's
in
much,
Washington.
It's
the other
much
night.
more of a show. It's much more of a show, and it's a bit more fun and energetic. And I think it's great. It's highly addictive, and also then just from a sort of nerdier point of view as well. There's so many more rabbit holes you can go down for the US. There's so many more data points. There's so many more things to look out for. So many different counties, and it's this extraordinary situation where you're dealing with an election where the margins that decide the vote could be tiny. I mean, tens of thousands of votes in a population of hundreds of millions of people. But the variables are so great. And so you don't quite know, maybe, 10,000 votes gained in this demographic, but then 5,000 votes lost in the other might swing a state. And that's just fascinating.
Yeah, it certainly is. And we'll talk more about the polling and actually the betting, because there is a disparity between what the betting markets say and what the polling says, which is definitely worth discussing this evening. Let's turn our attention to a couple of recent news stories. Kamala Harris has responded to Donald Trump's comments about women. Kamala Harris has said his comments are offensive to everybody. Trump was speaking at a rally in Wisconsin last night when he said he would be a protector of women, whether they like it or not.
Well, I want to protect the women of our country. I want to protect the women. Sir, please don't say that. Why? They said we think it's very inappropriate for you to say. So why? I'm president. I want to protect the women of our country. They said, sir, I just think it's inappropriate for you to say. Pay these guys a lot of money. Can you believe it? I said, well, I'm going to do it whether the women like it or not. I'm going to protect them.
Harris jumped on the idea, posting on social media that Donald Trump thinks he should get to make decisions about what you do with your body. This is, of course, one of the big campaign strong points for Kamala Harris, women's rights. She's been campaigning on this and she polls well on this, so it's natural for her to sort of turn this against Donald Trump. Donald Trump, though, Molly, is still trying to swipe that slight hex on him that he isn't as convincing maybe as he could be on how he feels about Roe versus Wade, reproductive rights, women's rights.
Well, I think when Trump made that comment, I heard from some of my Republican sources like, oh my God, is he trying to lose this election? Because he sort of couldn't have found a better way to play into the exact narrative that the Democrats are trying to paint about him, which is this idea that he thinks he knows what's best for women and wants to control them, including controlling their bodies. I mean, we are anticipating that this election could see the largest gender gap of any election in American history. And interestingly, it seems to have very little to do with the fact that that this election could potentially result in our first ever woman president. It has much more to do with the combination of Roe v. Wade having been overturned in 2022. So this is the first election since abortion rights have not been guaranteed nationwide, and also the way that Donald Trump campaigns and the way he speaks about women and the things that he's been accused of with regard to women. He's always been a very polarizing figure among women for that reason. And so a comment like that, where in the course of saying, I don't see why I shouldn't be able to say I want to protect women, he then goes even further. Even his former rival, Nikki Haley, who has endorsed him, came out and said the other day that because Trump is making such an overt play for the male vote, he risks alienating a lot of women with the way he's talking about these issues.
Scarlett, let's just come to you quickly on this huge gender gap. What does the polling show?
The polling does show a stark gender gap on the last election, but not actually a historic one. So at the moment, Kamala Harris is performing about as well with women as Clinton did in 2016, but she's actually performing worse with men. So Trump is not, at the moment, currently underperforming where he was with women in 2016, which is not a good place to be, by the way. I do not think it's a good thing for the Republican Party or for Trump long term that they are putting off women voters that otherwise they should be probably winning over on plenty of other issues. But at the moment, it does not look like it would be historic. I think what Democrats are really hoping that actually there's still a bit more room for them to go, that polls aren't picking up all these women that are changing their mind or saying they're going to vote, or be motivated to vote, crucially, and actually turn out. And I think one of the postmortems that, will happen if Harris does win, especially if she wins comfortably, which absolutely may happen, is that everyone underestimated the extent to the appeal that women's rights and abortion specifically had with women, and the extent that Kamala Harris was able to galvanise women.
Yeah, because she really has chosen that as one of her campaign points again and again and again. And some may say, look, you're forgetting about other things. I mean, let's just talk about men. So she's polling worse with men, Scarlett, than Hillary Clinton did, Kamala Harris. And so because things are so tight, Joanna Masker, is there more that Kamala Harris can do to attract the male vote?
Well, look, I think when we talk about it being tight, we saw in 2022, Republicans tell us that there was going to be a red wave, and there wasn't. A lot of the people who voted against the Republican, especially the Trump-endorsed candidates, were, for 2022, we saw women show up and vote against the Trump-endorsed candidates. So, Kamala Harris is absolutely trying to get men. It's interesting because particularly white, educated men are starting to break towards Kamala Harris. So, she needs to get that contingent, but if she beats him with women who are showing up and turning in their ballots more and earlier than men, then she could win this thing. I was just laughing at you guys admiring our show. My job for 8 years was setting up that show as director of press advance, and I can't wait for it to all be over.
Well, it's very much appreciated from Scarlett's point of view. Trump was making those comments about women dressed as a garbage man. Well, he basically had his usual gear on and then had sort of a luminous tabard, a fluorescent bib on stage. That was a reaction to these comments from Joe Biden.
Donald Trump has no character. He doesn't give a damn about the Latino community. And just the other day, a speaker at his rally called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. Well, let me tell you something. I don't know the Puerto Rican that I know, or Puerto Rico where I'm in my home state of Delaware. They're good, decent, honorable people. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. His demonization of Latinos is unconscionable.
There we go. So Biden and the White House team clarifying that his comments he was not calling Trump's voters garbage. He was calling the comedian who made those horrible comments about Puerto Rico being a floating island of garbage. He was calling him garbage or rubbish. So there's a bit of toing and froing here. Let's just take our mind back to Donald Trump. Here he is getting into this personalised giant rubbish lorry, or garbage lorry as you guys will call it over in the States.
I think the Democrats have done a very poor job. We're leading in every state. We're leading big, and I think that the comment made by really both of them, because there are really two of them, about being garbage, maybe 250 million people, they shouldn't be talking. That's like deplorable for Hillary. This is the deplorable for Hillary, and I think this is worse actually. For Joe Biden to make that statement, it's really a disgrace.
I actually wish that they'd stop filming or taking audio outside garbage lorries, Air Force One, other loud bits in the background, because you can never hear it, and it's always Trump or Biden. And Trump's normally fairly good at getting his point across, but Joe Biden is just ridiculous trying to hear him in front of any loud machinery whatsoever. Republicans are having a lot of fun with all the garbage content, Molly Ball. This is working for Donald Trump, isn't it? Although the comments were at a Republican rally, a huge Republican rally initially, this is where Donald Trump's strong. He's sort of taking a gag and he's going with it.
I don't think we know whether this actually helps him in the end, whether there really is anyone who is receptive to this argument, who wasn't already going to vote for Trump. You heard him there compare this to the comment that Hillary Clinton made shortly before the 2016 election, when she said that she believed about half of Donald Trump's supporters belonged in what she called the basket of deplorables. And this was then taken up by Trump supporters as a sort of proud rallying cry, because so much of Donald Trump's appeal, so much of his pitch is about this idea that the elites are looking down on you, and that you resent the sort of overbearing, condescending Democrats and the way that they condescend to people. But that was a circumstance where it was Hillary Clinton herself who had said it. This was said by Joe Biden, who is not the candidate. And it was said in response to the racist joke at Trump's rally, which we did see reverberate quite broadly in the Latino community. And that is a demographic where Trump has been making some very significant inroads and had hoped to really cut into the traditionally large Democratic margins with Hispanic voters. And again, we don't know the magnitude of these effects in either direction, but if there is a backlash against Trump in that community, that could end up hurting him more than the Biden comment helps him. So at this stage of the game, it's just a few days before the election. We'll see soon.
One more Trump clip, just because we had to. He kept his garbage man's uniform on for his rally. Let's have a listen.
They said it would be unbelievable if you could wear it on stage. I said, and I said, no way. I got 25,000 people standing outside. I got all these people here. There's no way I'm wearing it on stage. They said, oh, okay, sir. I said, get me my jacket. But if you did, it actually makes you look thinner. I said, and they got me. I said, I want to wear it on stage.
Yeah, I mean, that is vintage Donald Trump. Joanna Masker, another thing that Trump's been saying over the past few days, he's definitely sounding more confident, kind of comments to the tune of it's in the bag, it's looking great, which could backfire on him if not enough people are engaged or feel like they can make the difference between the contest of Trump versus Harris. Is this the wrong approach? I mean, you're obviously a Democrat, so you'll probably tell me it's exactly the right approach if you want Kamala Harris to win. But it's just interesting, isn't it, how, she's urging people to get out to vote. She's taken it, seriously to the point where she's saying to people that you could make the difference. Whereas Donald Trump's sort of going for it's in the bag, the sort of confident approach.
Well, and look, Trump's a showman, and he's trying to build this confidence. I was with Sean Spicer in Arizona last week, and Sean Spicer actually wanted to bet me $2,000 that they were going to beat Kamala Harris. I disagree with that
very much. What did you say, Joanna?
I did not bet him because I don't bet. But ultimately, I do believe that Kamala Harris stands the best chance for this election. We've got people out working. In fact, when we were in Arizona, the Waltz rally was bigger than the J.D. Vance rally. We have hundreds of people out knocking doors. And so when you look at it, yes, the Republicans are returning their ballots, but we don't know that they're always breaking for Trump. There is still that divide. So they're very confident. But I remember when those Clinton folks were very confident, and I thought that was a bad idea. And I turned out to be right. This time, my money, if I was betting, would be on Kamala Harris.
Well, you would say that, wouldn't you? But we just don't know, do we, Scarlett?
I did not last time, just to clarify.
Okay.
Trump,
all right.
Trump,
okay.
I said it would be Trump versus Hillary. So.
No, we don't know. It's an incredibly close race. I do think, though, that something that you're now seeing from model forecasts in terms of probabilities, and also actually from the direction of travel with the polling, despite the fact that they still show a race that is incredibly close, that it looks like a race that is increasingly in Trump's favour, or at least one in which the momentum over the last, say, 3 weeks has been one which is inching towards Trump. And I do think that is giving quite a lot of people pause for thought. It's also, when you zoom out, there there are a lot of things apart from sort of Trump himself, although his numbers are also looking better than they ever have done before, which is something that's quite striking, where the fundamentals favour the Republicans this time round. Harris part of an incumbent for an unpopular administration where people do not like the policies, and the policies issues favour Trump, with the exception of abortion, women's rights, which obviously we've already talked about, but especially immigration and the economy, and especially in those swing states, those underlying issues favour Trump and the Republicans. So it's very, very close. I think it looks like something that is set up for Trump to win, but I don't think that by any means, means he will do it.
He's holding a rally at the moment in New Mexico, Albuquerque. Is it Albuquerque or Albuquerque?
Albuquerque, I say, but I don't know if I'm right.
Yep. Yeah, great. Okay, Few, thank you very much before I offend any American listeners. So he's basically on the border, capitalising on his strong numbers over immigration and the border, calling Kamala Harris grossly incompetent. He said that rough and tough hombres were coming across the border. A callback to a comment he made in 2016 during a debate with the then Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton. We've got some bad hombres here and we're going to get them out, he said. That's what he's doing right now. Let's talk about, actually, Scarlett, polling versus betting. This is just a point of interest because the betting markets, and yes, we know it's different. Betting is, putting money on an outcome. Polling is polling a whole group of people to see what they think. But the betting markets are really strongly in favour of Donald Trump. Is that because Trump supporters are more likely to put a bet on him? What is the reason?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can put it down to two things. Firstly, you do tend to see with betting markets that once something gets momentum, it builds quite quickly, naturally, even if people aren't deliberately distorting it. And then they are also very open to distortion, both by people wanting to make money off them, but also by people wanting to give the illusion that there's a better sort of setting for their candidate, or their candidate in whatever race might have better hopes, which could well be what's going on here. I feel like I need to issue a disclaimer, which is that my firm is actually more in line with the betting markets in terms of the model that we're projecting, and we have about just under a 2 in 3 chance of a Trump win, a 1 in 3 chance of a Harris win as our latest from our model.
That's really interesting, which is kind of out of step with the neck and neck.
It's out, exactly. So in terms of probabilities, but it's still that still includes states which are neck and neck. So the 7 swing states are neck and neck, but just the overall model says that the likely outcome for the electoral college is that 2 in 3 chance Trump wins it, 1 in 3 chance Harris. Again, slightly under 2 in 3, slightly more than 1 in 3. But broadly speaking, whereas most pollsters are now sitting around a sort of 55% chance of a Trump win, we were there. Overall, exactly. We were there a couple of weeks ago. We had Harris ahead, it's worth saying, end of August, early September. And then we had Trump slowly building up. He's now slightly coming back down again. He peaked with us, I think, a few days ago and is starting to trickle down. So we'll see where it ends up. Might well be that we fall back to about 55. But yes, I do feel the need to say that betting markets are not normally a good way if you're trying to work out what's going to happen at the election. But as it happens this time, I'm aligned with them. So, but that's by chance.
Okay, thank you very much to Martin, who sent me "The King of Rock and Roll" by Prefab Sprout, which features Albuquerque in it. If anyone remembers that song, and I do, thank you very much.
Well, I did want to say on Albuquerque, actually, just to Joanna's point very quickly, I think on that point about Trump being very confident, it might be that we look back at the Madison Square Garden rally, aside from those comments, and Albuquerque as being this fantastic victory lap and aren't they clever and all the rest of it. But it might be, if he loses, that it's like Clinton spending too much resources in Florida and not spending enough time in the blue wall. If he does lose swing states, especially ones that he's not expecting to, I think there'll be a lot of questions being asked about why he's choosing to spend time in New Mexico now.
A new report today from the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism claims there could be a potential surge in political violence after polling day. Molly Ball, I know everyone will be keeping a close eye on this because it is neck and neck for many people, and because it is so close, and it actually could take most of next week to actually sort out who's actually won the thing, mightn't it? There is going to be kind of high stress on both sides, particularly, and a concern that there might be a repeat of the dissent around the 2020 election, certainly from Donald Trump supporters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wrote an article this past week with the headline, America is having a panic attack about the election. And it's just a theme that you hear from voters on all sides, voters at political events, but also just rank and file voters who I spoke to coming in and out of a polling site in a politically mixed suburb of Atlanta. And we asked in our Wall Street Journal poll that was released last week whether people believe the country will suffer permanent damage if their candidate loses, and 87% of voters said yes to that question. Only 10% of Americans think it's all going to be okay no matter what happens in the election. So, there's a feeling, and I found it is that it's so close. That's part of it. It's the uncertainty of just not having any sense of which way this is likely to go. This looks like it's going to be the closest election in American history, but it's not just that. It's a feeling that the stakes are incredibly high. And candidates always will say this is such an important election as a way to motivate their supporters. But people have really internalized the idea that the people said to me over and over that this does not feel like a normal election. It feels like something bigger than that. It feels like the potential end of our democratic experiment, and so people have really internalized the idea that the entire country could somehow come to an end if the election goes the wrong way. And so because of that, people are feeling just a really intense sense of anxiety and foreboding, and feeling like it is really all on the line in this election.
To that point, Joanna Masker, if it looks more than likely that Donald Trump has won the election, should Kamala Harris concede as quickly and efficiently as possible so not to draw out any speculation at all, any dissent from Trump supporters?
Look, I think Donald Trump would want the time to have any legal challenges that he may have. Kamala Harris will want that time to have any legal challenges that she will have.